David,
Here.
Alex,
Here.
Javier,
Here.
Namdi, not yet, Michael,
Here.
Josie,
Here.
Cynthia,
Here.
and Carol.
Here.
And Noah, Elizabeth just joined as well.
Awesome, thank you.
All right. So the first agenda item before we get into the others is the acceptance of the approval of the meeting minutes from last week. So does anyone have any changes or amendments that need to be made to the minutes? All right, then we'll go on to approve the minutes. Noah, can you give us a call again?
Yes. Lois?
Here.
Elizabeth?
I think Elizabeth is still connecting to audio.
Oh, okay, I'll circle back. Booker,
Yes.
Dan,
Yes.
Nick,
Yes.
David,
Yes.
Alex,
Yes.
Javier,
Yes.
Michael,
Yes.
Josie,
Yes.
Cynthia,
Yes.
Carol.
Yes.
Awesome. And then Elizabeth?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right, great. So we'll jump in to the public comment period. So we'll have a period of a maximum of 30 minutes for anyone who wishes to offer public comment. Public comments are limited to 3 minutes per person. To put yourself in the queue for that, you can use the participants, the raise hand feature on the participants window. So if you're on Zoom, I'm going to click participants and then select raise hand. It'll put you in the queue and I'll call on you to unmute. And that's when the time will start for your comment. And it looks like the first person is phone number 582-7081.
Hello.
Hello.
This is Hildegard Friedman, living in government housing, Building G, Cahill, Building G, apartment 68. And I have been observing a lack of commitment and lack of success observing detox over the years. I've been here for 3 years and I was in for Sander for over 2 years. Someone just died, but there are more instances here of overdoses and suicides that may have been deaths. And I'm also very, very upset with the governor's amendment. I know you're here to discuss what the police will do, but the governor's amendment to the decision of the legislature that came through on the 11th hour just recently totally weakened the core racial justice provisions and pleased, I'm sure, all the unions that were upset, and it totally zeroed out on police accommodations, police accountability, the use of force, and common sense regulations. So I am more than upset. I intend to do things about this and work, I believe, with Booker Bush, who I believe has accepted bringing me in as a public speaker on opiates sometime in January or later. I thank you so very much. My phone is 413-582-7081. I did the Harvard Law Program on negotiation in 1996. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. So we're looking through here. Does anyone else have any other public comments? Richard. And then Ed, I see you raising your hand as well.
Just unmuted myself. I hope I did that correctly.
Yep, you're good.
Hello, Happy New Year to you all. Richard Hendrick, 30 Main Street, Northampton. These are exceptional times for me, difficult, and perhaps for you, and yet you keep your nose to the grindstone. I thank you for that. I look forward to observing your process of decision making. Good luck with that. Yes, I can see where the cart can be seen to be before the horse, and that you may well be served by pausing and exploring your values. Good luck with that. December 23rd, less than 2 weeks ago, Ohio police officer kills Black man while body camera wasn't on, the mayor says. It goes on and on and on, a biased comment I know on my part. Like the senseless shootings that have gone on and on over the years, that perhaps I have become either numb or indifferent to. Can I become numb or indifferent to George Floyd? The Don Quixote was alive and well with me last night, tilting at windmills. Visions of the police building coming to a name change, the Department of Community Safety, and inside a sandbox with everyone concerned about safety in the community, playing, getting along, talking to one another, working it out, where the footprints of the police are soft and few. Reimagining? Why not? I hope that you can come to an appropriate replacement for Carmen Lopez and Dana Olivio. Is it inappropriate for me to suggest Yaping Douglas? Better to ask for forgiveness than permission. Just a point of information, whether it's an hour as expressed on September 10 or 30 minutes as expressed on December 22nd, no one has been timed out of an opportunity to express a general comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the next person is Ed Olmsted and then Rye Buckley.
Thank you. I want to thank the members of the commission for your continued hard work and commitment in identifying the best ways for the city of Northampton to respond to the needs of its residents and visitors. And appreciate your continuing this in the new year. My comments tonight are focused on the directive to the commission listed under recruitment and diversity policies that asks the commission to study transitioning 911 calls for mental health, houselessness, substance abuse disorder, and other non-criminal services and domestic violence calls to civilian responders or social service agencies. I'm concerned about the compensation and benefits of those who have traditionally been employed in helping professions related to mental health, stable housing, substance abuse, and other supportive and preventative services, that they do not favorably measure up to those of police officers currently, or often do not measure up to those of police officers currently in our employ. In my experience, people working in social service and other helping professions have been more likely to be women and people of color. Furthermore, the compensation of benefits have not been comparable to city employees in general. If we are going to formally or informally shift responsibilities from police departments to other people and agencies, their salaries and benefits should be comparable to those officers currently performing those services. This doesn't mean the same necessarily. However, I urge the commission to be mindful of the transition of any responsibilities and consider such factors as wages, benefits, health insurance, paid time off, disability compensation, shift differentials, stability of employment, workload, career advancement options, training and education options, attractive retirement plans, and bargaining power concerning their working environment. I know these considerations have not escaped the attention of the members of this commission. I'm here just to encourage you, your continued attention to this. Thank you.
So thank you very much. The next person is Rye Buckley.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yep, you're good to go.
Thank you. First, I want to thank the Commission for all the work that it's done so far, and particularly for all the additional hours you have all put in recently to create this preliminary report. And then I want to emphasize again the importance of seeking and prioritizing the voices of those most harmed by policing. In order to understand the current harm of policing in the carceral system and understand how to create real public safety, you must hear the voices of those who experience policing the most. I know it is much easier to use the police website and other sources created by the police and by the city government, but I just want to re-stress the incredible importance of hearing from those most affected by policing. Thank you again for all you do, and I look forward to this meeting.
All right, thank you very much. The next person is Robert Eastman.
Hey everyone. I just have a short comment. I haven't had a chance to read the draft that you sent out, but I have heard a little bit about it, and I just wanted to take a minute to remember why we're all here, which is that we were demanding justice for Black lives who are murdered at the hands of police every day in our country. And I think it's just important to remember that as we get into the nitty-gritty of addressing specific problems in Northampton. And to keep that in mind, particularly as where I was saying in recommendations, addressing current social services that are available and already collaborate with the police. I think peer-led is just the way to go. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Do we have any other public comment? All right, so I'm not seeing any. So what we'll do now is move on to our next agenda item, which is a presentation and question and answer with Rachel Brownberg. Just to introduce her for everyone, Rachel is a co-founder of the Reach Out Response Network and the Canadian National Coordinator of the International Mobile Services Association. She collaborates with a network of service providers to connect individuals across Canada and the US who are building civilian-led mobile crisis services in their communities. Rachel is also a co-founder of the International Mobile Services Association, which is an emerging binational group with the purposes of researching, assessing, and identifying best practice models of mobile response services that support or are alternatives to traditional 911 emergency services. Rachel is also a member of the Toronto Regional Human Services and Justice Coordinating Committee and the Center for Addiction and Mental Health Constituency Council. And she's been working as a peer supporter and peer educator for the past 7 years with organizations such as Stella's Place, CAMH, Planned Parenthood, the LGBT Youth Line, and the Canadian Suicide Prevention Services. So thank you very much. And Rachel, I will hand it off to you.
Thank you all for having me. I'm really glad to be here virtually. So I guess I'll share a little bit about some of the work that we're doing in Toronto and some of what I know from the research that I've done through the International Mobile Services Association about what is effective and what works in a new kind of in the kind of model that you guys are thinking about putting together for your city of non-police alternative crisis response service. So just to give you some context about what's going on in Toronto. So in June of last year, in June of 2020, City Council in Toronto had voted to design and implement the non-police crisis service that could respond to lots of the mental health and substance use calls that right now go to the police. And for context, Toronto's a big city. We about 2.7 million people who live in Toronto. And in terms of 911 calls related to mental health, last year, police took 30,000 mental health related calls that were not mental health plus crime or mental health plus danger or mental health plus violence, just straight mental health calls. And about 10,000 of those calls were suicide calls or suicide related calls, which can encompass a broad number of things. And, because of those numbers and because of some recent deaths of people in mental health crisis during interactions with police in Canada, City Council in Toronto felt like this was a moment to do something about this problem, and they really quickly became invested in designing and developing an alternative service. And my organization, we've been doing a lot of work and research to learn about different crisis response models for about 2 years prior to City Council voting on this. So when they voted yes, we were really in a position to step in and be like, hey, we have a lot of the information that you're looking for that's really going to help you in developing this kind of model. So we signed a contract with the city. We shared a whole bunch of research with them. We connected them with lots of other cities doing similar things in Canada and the US. And we did a whole bunch of community engagement. We did, over 3 months, we did 18 town halls, 2 large surveys, and about 150 individual interviews and key informant interviews to really hear from the community what they wanted to see in this new service. We talked to lots of different people. We talked with service users. We talked with mental health workers. We talked with family members of people with mental health challenges. We talked with Black folks, Indigenous folks, deaf folks, autistic folks, high school students, people with developmental disabilities, all the groups that we identified who would be most impacted by this new kind of service. And what we heard from the community was actually pretty aligned with the best practices that we've seen in lots of other cities. And we put together a 92-page report that was very intense to write. As the person who wrote it, it was very intense, just explaining what we'd heard from the community and what we'd seen in the research. And basically in that report, we recommended that Toronto develop a service staffed exclusively by mental health clinicians and peer support workers from the communities they serve. We recommended that the service be accessible via 911 dispatch directly, rather than people needing to call a separate number. And we recommended that the service would be available 24/7 across the city with immediate response times. 911 dispatch integration is something that we've seen most cities that have effective models. They have integrated the service just the same way as police and EMS and fire can be dispatched through 911. You would want this new service to be able to be directly dispatched as well, just because 911 is often the number that people know to call when, people are trained from a very young age. When any kind of crisis is happening, 911 is the number to call. And what we also know from the research is that the majority of the time when a 911 call is being made about a mental health crisis, it's not actually the person in crisis calling themselves. It's often, about 30% of the time, it's a family member or friend who's calling. Another 30% of the time, it's a service provider calling. And a lot of the time, it's just like a bystander, just someone on the street who sees something happening. They don't know the person. They're just thinking, oh, there's something wrong. Let's call 911. And having a separate number that's like, call this number if someone's in a mental health crisis, that really relies on your average person being able to identify what is a mental health crisis versus what is not. And your average person is not very good at that. So our recommendation was for 911 integration. And what we've seen internationally is that there are a lot of cities that either have this model or in the process of building this model, and it seems to work quite effectively. So from our research, we've identified probably a few dozen cities that either have an alternative crisis service for mental health calls like the one that we are proposing. So that's one that is integrated into city services, not just like a mobile crisis center, distress center that's like a standalone service, but what we're really talking about is a crisis service that is non-police, but that is integrated into the city in some way, often via 911 dispatch. And there's been a lot of interest over the past year. A lot of cities that historically, like 3 years ago or 5 years ago, were not very interested in this topic, including Toronto, but also including a lot of US cities, have all of a sudden gotten quite interested because of number of deaths of people in crisis, or just generally deaths of people who have interacted with or during interactions with police. And that's really important and needs to be, that's a really important part of this conversation. But one other thing for our network, that's a really important part of the conversation, but we also take kind of a broader view to that as well. Like the teams that we're proposing aren't about being anti-police. They're not really, like, we don't really see them as actually being about police at all. We really see it as about making sure that the right person responds to the right situation at the right time. So just like, you know, we wouldn't send police to fight fires, we would send firefighters to go fight fires. And, you know, what we see and what we've heard from the community is that people have a really strong association between police with violence and crime. Like that is their job. Police fight violence, they fight crime. Mental health crisis, what we see from the data, mental health crisis is rarely violent, and it's never a crime. It's a person who is experiencing a health crisis. And, you know, it makes sense. You send a health worker to go respond to a heart attack. You should also send a health worker to respond to a health crisis. So for us, the way that we sort of talk about these kinds of teams, it's not really about police so much. It's about like who should be, what is a mental health crisis and who is the right person to respond to that. And also what are the implications in terms of like the stigma that gets attached to mental health crisis when police are responding because of that association in people's minds between police and crime and violence. And also in terms of outcomes, like whether someone is actually getting adequate support, and what kind of response would that person need in order to feel like they're being supported, that they're being de-escalated, and that they're actually being connected with useful resources. During our community engagement, we heard a lot of stories of people who had called 911 for themselves or for a family member or friend, and how these experiences, you know, even if they don't lead to any kind of physical harm, which most of the time they don't, but even when these experiences are like, they're not dangerous, they often just don't help people. They often don't actually lead people to get connected with the support that they need in that moment. And sometimes they can be scary and traumatic, and sometimes they can be really violent and dangerous and even lethal. So, you know, we had one young woman who came to one of our town halls who told us about a time that she was feeling suicidal and someone had called 911. I think a family member had called 911 thinking that this was the right way to get her help. And, you know, 6 male cops showed up, 6 of them for this, like, you know, she was 19 at the time. And, you know, she said they were nice. They were not mean to her. They didn't yell at her. They didn't like physically hurt her, but they told her, you know, this is how it is. We have to handcuff you. We have to take you to the hospital. So they took her out of her apartment in handcuffs, and she felt completely humiliated in front of her neighbors. She felt really scared. She felt like a criminal. She felt like she'd done something wrong, even though like she hadn't. She was just asking for help when she was feeling suicidal. And, you know, even though like the police officers themselves, they were nice people, they weren't like doing anything to hurt her on purpose. But it, you know, this situation was still really traumatic and stigmatizing for her. And, you know, then she got to the hospital and she waited 8 hours to see a psychiatrist. And when she did see the psychiatrist, she was told that she didn't actually meet the criteria for an involuntary admission. So they just sent her home. She didn't get connected with any resources. She didn't get any support. This was a super traumatic experience for her. cost, in Canada where we have universal healthcare and all of this is taxpayer funded. She just sat in an emergency room for 8 hours for no reason, taking up resources that other people could have used and didn't actually get any care. So that's really the thing that we're trying to change, and the thing that we're talking about with other cities, that how important it is to build teams that can come to where a person is at, do that risk assessment on the spot, figure out how to connect the person with the resources they need to stay safe and, stay out of hospital if possible. Sometimes person needs to be in a hospital, but a lot of the time they don't. What we've seen from data from the hospitals in Toronto is that, about between 80 and 90% of the time when someone is presenting for a mental health related situation at the emergency room, they're actually not admitted. They don't meet criteria for admission. So making sure that the people who don't meet criteria for admission to a hospital, that they're just not going to the hospital because it's not necessary and it's not always a good experience. So one thing that I wanted to talk about that we're proposing, or that the city of Toronto is going to be building into our model, and that some other cities have also built into their model, and it seems like it's very effective, is peer workers being on the front lines of these teams. So just so everyone is on the same page about peer workers are people with their own lived experience of mental health or substance use challenges. And they're also folks who have received extensive training on how to leverage that experience to support others going through similar challenges. There are lots of programs, actually even more in the United States than in Canada, that train peer workers in doing mental health support, in doing crisis intervention. Peer workers can get certifications in this kind of thing, just like any other mental health worker can get certified. Peer workers can as well. And there are lots of different programs across Canada and the US where peer workers provide crisis support. So some of those could be like crisis lines. Some of them can be respite centers where people in crisis can have a safe place to stay for a few days. One example of this in the US is, I think it's called Soteria House. I've read it. I don't know how to say it, but I've read good things about it. And then there's some mobile crisis teams similar to the ones that we're proposing that employ peer workers. So there's a team in Utah called MCOT that employs peers and clinicians who work together. There's also a team in New York City called LEAD that does something similar. And then there are lots of different programs that employ peer workers to provide ongoing care in the same way that clinicians might provide weekly care or drop-in sessions, for example, through a mental health agency. One really good example that I don't have tons of time to talk about today, but that you can look up if you're interested, is the Parachute program in New York City. They employ peers to do a whole bunch of stuff. It's a really good program. You should Google it. But so peer workers can do a lot of the same things that mental health clinicians can do. They can do active listening. They can do risk assessments. They can do crisis intervention. I've worked as a peer worker for a number of years. I've also done other types of mental health work, but when I was a peer worker, I would talk to people who are suicidal and I would support them with that. So peer workers can do those kinds of things, but peer workers also bring some additional added value to the teams that they work on. And there are a few different unique things about peer work. One of them is just that peer workers tend to provide high quality care when you have peer workers who are well trained in how to leverage their lived experience to support people. Peer workers who have been through something themselves, that really gives them a strong intuitive sense of how to support someone else and what is going to be helpful for this person in crisis and how this person in crisis might be feeling and what they might need. And I found that when I was working in peer support and clients would ask me about my own lived experience, I'm not usually someone who would bring up a lot about my own experience myself, but I found that when clients asked, I did share a little bit with them, that often really was helpful for them and would build a lot of trust. And that, clients would often say wow, you really get it, in a way that was really valuable and felt supportive for them. And what I also find with peer work is that it can really promote hope for someone who is experiencing a crisis, like to know that there's someone who is with them, who's supporting them, who has been through it and come out the other side of it. Like when someone is in crisis, they're often feeling really overwhelmed, and it feels like the moment that they're in is like all there is. This is the only moment. And being able to see someone else who is there in like a helping capacity, who has gone through something similar, come through it, and is now providing support to them, that can be really empowering and can create a lot of hope and sort of help someone see, you know, this is just a moment that they're in and there is something beyond that. And I guess the final thing is just that having peer workers involved on the team can really reduce stigma and shame in relation to a mental health crisis. Like often people who are struggling with mental health, they feel very alone, they feel ashamed, they feel like there's something wrong with them. And of course, like police showing up definitely compounds that. People feel like they're criminals. People feel like they've done something wrong. People feel like they're bad. People feel scared. People feel stigmatized. But having someone else who's there, who has their own lived experience and is really like owning the fact that they have lived experience, that they see that as a positive thing and as an added benefit. And especially, I think, for the person in crisis, knowing that the organization or that is coming out to help them, that they see having lived experience as an added benefit, and that this is sort of the value that we're putting out into the world, that there is something beneficial and valuable and useful and good about, you know, having struggled and having come through that struggle and using that struggle to help others. That's something that can be really valuable for someone who is in crisis and can help them shape their view of themselves in a much more positive way. This is something I've heard a lot from clients. So some things to think about in terms of peer workers. I guess some other considerations around that are just in terms of, you know, if we're employing peers, making sure that there's equity in employment. Some of the models that we've seen, there are a few different ways that peers can be employed. So one of them is like the LEAD team in New York City or the MCOT team in Utah, where they have a peer worker paired with a mental health clinician, like a social worker or a psychotherapist or someone like that, or like sometimes like a case manager. Another way that is, I think, more common, well, I know is more common because I know lots of different cities that do this stuff, is to just have like one undifferentiated role that is like the role of a crisis worker. And you can prioritize peer workers to hire for that role. You can also hire clinicians, but definitely prioritizing people with lived experience is valuable for those kinds of positions. And one of the concerns that sometimes comes up when you have two separate roles is that sometimes there can be inequity between those two roles. It's important to make sure that we're avoiding like hierarchy. If you have two people who are doing the same job, we're working together on a team, it's important that they actually like be together on the team, that it's not like one person is the real worker and one person is just like the person with lived experience who is just here because we feel sorry for them. That's not good. And just in terms of things like pay equity and in terms of like making sure that everyone has access to the same benefits, stuff like that. And making sure that everyone on the team is provided adequate support and training rather than singling like peer workers out as, oh, well, you guys are fragile and baby and we need to take care of you, in a way that we wouldn't take care of other people. Like, it's, you know, all of you know this is really emotionally intense work, like for responding to people in crisis, and everyone needs support in doing this kind of work, and that's normal and doesn't need to be stigmatized. So in terms of, so what Toronto is doing, we're going with the crisis worker model, where we're actually, what we're doing is pairing a medical staff member who will probably be a medic, might be a nurse. We've recommended it not be a nurse, but we're going to see what the city does. It's probably going to be a medic who will be paired with a crisis worker, and we're going to prioritize the hiring of peer workers to fill those positions. What we've also done in Toronto is, so what's going to be happening is we're going to be creating an oversight body that will like govern and oversee the pilot that we're going to be operating. So the pilot in Toronto is going to be operational in January of 2022. So we're going to spend basically the rest of this year working to build the foundation for that pilot. And part of that will be setting up the governance body. And the governance body is going to be made up of at least 51% people with lived experience, or people who have struggled with their own mental health challenges. That's something that we were very excited about when the city staff proposed that. And one other thing, just in terms of governance and also in terms of staff for the team, something we've thought a lot about in Toronto is the importance of incorporating people with diverse backgrounds onto the teams and also into the governance model. Toronto is a very diverse city. One of the things we've heard from the community is the importance, for example, of linguistic diversity on the teams, making sure that someone who is in crisis can be responded to by a crisis worker who speaks their native language instead of having to go through an interpreter. That's one thing that we're sort of figuring out, how to make sure that the agencies that we're partnering with are able to provide that as much as possible. Also making sure that we're involving culturally specific services as much as possible. Toronto has a very large Black population, has a very large Muslim population, we're a very diverse city. So making sure that folks from those communities are represented in governing the new model and also in staffing the new model. One other thing that Toronto's doing that I think is kind of cool is we're putting together, so we're going to have a pilot that is operating in 2 to 4 different parts of the city. So there will be like 4 anchor agencies that operate, or 2 to 4 anchor agencies that operate the service in different parts of the city to start with for the pilot. We're also putting together a pilot specifically for Indigenous folks in Toronto. And that will be made up, like the governance body will be entirely Indigenous, the staff will be entirely Indigenous, it will serve only Indigenous folks, there will be an Indigenous evaluation team, and that's something that is also really important in terms of making sure that the service that is being provided is culturally relevant to the people that it's serving. And another thing to note just on that is the importance that like any team that is being built in any city, like I've worked with and talked to and engaged with lots of different cities across Canada and the US, some really big cities, some really small towns. And the team is going to look different depending on where it is. Toronto is a much more diverse city than, for example, Eugene, Oregon, which is the city that pioneered the first of these models. And they've been their team Cahoots, which I know you guys probably know about already, so I won't go on a lot about Cahoots, but they've been around for 31 years. They're amazing. I love them. They're great. Yeah, but their city looks very different than Toronto looks. It's much smaller, much less diverse. So it's going to have to look different in Toronto. Obviously, it'll look different in Northampton than it does in Toronto, or than it does in Eugene, or than it does in New York, or than it does in San Francisco. And that makes sense. It's about figuring out like what works for your individual city. I think that's basically what I've got for you now. I'm happy to take lots of questions, love questions about anything that I've shared or any of the international models that we've been looking at. I didn't go like super in depth into that because I'm not sure what is most relevant for you guys, but like questions are great.
So Alex and then Carol.
Thanks, Rachel, so much. So we're a small city, 30,000 people, and are there any examples of cities of our size supporting a full-time mental health crisis response? And would partnering with neighboring communities make sense? Kind of what's the minimum size that you've seen people working on?
I think with much smaller communities, probably partnering with neighboring cities makes sense. I think the city that is probably the closest size to Northampton that I know of is that has had this team for a while is Olympia, Washington. It's about, I think, 45,000 people-ish. So like somewhat more, but not like huge city. And they have they have a team that it's called the Crisis Response Unit, CREW. It's been around since early 2019. I think it launched in early 2018. They have a team of social workers who are dispatched via the 911 system, and they provide crisis care, and it is an effective model for them. They haven't partnered with any other cities or neighboring areas. It's just in Olympia, but I mean, really up to you if that would be a model that makes sense to you.
Right. And then Carol?
So Rachel, thank you so much for the wealth of information you shared with us. It's very inspiring. And I have a comment on what I heard that I really loved, rather than a question. And this is consistent with some communication I got from a community member this week who, there are community members here who are regularly either sitting in on these meetings or writing to those of us who are on the commission with, framing things and bringing things to our attention. One of the things that came through in one of the letters I got this week, which I resonate with totally, and I can see in your program, is that you broadened your sense of what dispatch can be in under a public health umbrella rather than a public safety umbrella. And, we have used, here various language to describe policing that should be with the police and community response that shouldn't be with the police. And it's easy to fall into thinking it's all public safety. But your comments about developing a program to respond to people in need, in a variety of needs in the community, where there are disparities within community and there's personal crises. I think it's really important to see these as public health concerns rather than just public safety, because if we stay just with the public safety frame, we can unwittingly stigmatize people who are houseless, who are having a momentary crisis, who are not eating well, who are distressed for a variety of reasons. They are not a public safety issue for the rest of the community. Mm-hmm. And you agree with that. And so I think that it sounds like very consciously within Toronto, what you're deriving is a program that will inherently destigmatize the people to whom you're responding on the 911 calls who have particular needs in a particular moment or a period of time. And I love that. And I hope that we can take some of that philosophy and feeling and, that platform into some of our considerations when we make our recommendations. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next we have Booker, Nick, and then Javier, and then I'm going to throw myself at the end of that because I have a question too.
So thank you so much. This has been a marvelous presentation, and every question I was writing down, you answered a minute or two after I wrote it down, except for one, which is I'm going to ask you about funding for the projects you're about to do. I'm curious about your budgets, but what I'm really curious about, if you'll choose to answer it, is your funding coming from new funds that are going to be used to support the programs? Or is there any conscious effort to say we're shifting funding away from other things, for instance, policing, to what you're going to be doing?
That is a great question, and one that I have a ton of data on to answer. So thank you for asking that. So in terms of what's happening in Toronto, it's going to be funded at least partially by the city. It's not going to be funded via the police budget. Some parts of it might be funded by the health budget, but we haven't confirmed that yet because in Toronto or in Canada, the health budget is set by the province. I don't know if that's actually the same as for the United States. I'm not sure, but it's set by the province. The province's fiscal year ends at a different time than the city's fiscal year. So we're allocating some money in February for the fiscal year for the city, and then the fiscal year for the province we're going to deal with at their budgeting process time, which will be later. But in terms of other cities, I'm actually just going to my list of cities and funding sources for cities, because there are actually lots of different ways that these kinds of programs can get funded. The biggest one is, the two biggest ones are probably directly by the city, like being a line item in the city budget every year, or being part of the health budget. Some of these teams are funded with some money in the United States. Some of them are funded partly by the state and partly by the city, but some of the programs are also statewide programs, so that makes it possibly more complicated. There are few services that exist that are funded by the police budget. Cahoots is actually a line item in the police budget in Eugene, Oregon, which is interesting, especially because they've been around such a long time. Some of the teams that are currently being created are going to be funded by the police budget, probably, like a team in Oakland, team in Portland are going to be funded either partially or fully by the police budget, but that's not the most dominant model. Again, dominant models are the health budget and city budget. In terms of what this costs, so I personally have not seen the estimate for what it's going to cost in Toronto yet. That's going to be voted on by council in a couple of weeks, so I haven't seen the final number on it. But in terms of for a city the size of Northampton, probably the best numbers would be the numbers for Olympia, and they are to operate when they were in a pilot phase. I don't know what the amount was, but the amount for now to have it fully operational is about $500,000 a year. For it, it could potentially be lower than that depending on how you run the service. Could also be more expensive than that depending on how you run the service. Cahoots' budget for a city that is 170,000 people to operate the teams 24/7, their annual budget is $2.1 million. So it's probably in that range that we're looking at. And the way that Olympia actually funds their team is actually different than most other cities. What Olympia did was they had a public safety levy that was voted on, and a lot of so the money is a 0.1% sales tax that completely funds the team, and voters voted on it. Personally, if we could get that to happen in Toronto, that would be my favorite model, but they are unique in doing that. I haven't seen anywhere else where it was funded by a new tax, but we'll see. And then there are some cities that are currently being built, so say like Albuquerque's team, they are diverting money from existing, I think 5 different existing city departments to cover their new team, including police, but also including fire, ambulance, 2 other departments that I don't remember. So taking existing sources of money to put into the new team, but Toronto is just adding more money, not existing money. Does that answer your question? That was a long answer. A lot of information.
All right, thank you. So we'll do Nick and then Javier.
Rachel, thank you very much. This was really very interesting and very informative. And you're giving us a picture of the variety of approaches and the different ways that cities have to adapt it to their own unique needs. One of the questions that I have is about the training, and I am familiar with peer programs. We have some excellent peer programs in Western Massachusetts, and the recovery learning community is widely known for being very innovative. My question is, a peer being in a first responder role, do you have, is that is the training, what kind of extra training do you build in, or is it different that they're in a first responder role? Does that change things, or and how do you train them so that they feel prepared and equipped for this kind of responsiveness, or do you feel that it's not that specific to being a first responder?
I actually think it's more specific to being a first responder than it is to being a peer first responder. Like what we've seen, for example, Cahoots, they provide super intensive training to all their staff. Their staff do 500 hours of training, including like field work training, like shadowing training. But they spend a lot of time doing lots of, so I would say, peer workers need the same amount of training as anyone else needs to do a super intense job. And then obviously peer workers also need additional training in like how to leverage and use lived experience effectively. So basically the same kind of training that any peer worker in any program would get, plus the same kind of training that any peer worker in a that any person in a first responder role would get. And then I would also say, looking more broadly, it's really important that the agency that's employing peers have good training on how to employ peers in an equitable and effective manner, effective and equitable manner. One of the things, in my experience as a peer worker and as like training organizations and training people, is, the importance of building in structures within an organization to effectively support peers and effectively support other staff in working with peers. So for example, making sure that there's like one of the best practices I've seen is having a peer manager that is like a peer worker who is a manager of the peers, rather than having like a clinician who manages the peers. Mm-hmm. That is something that we've seen as a best practice, for example.
That's an excellent response, and it's very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. So Javier, and then I'm going to jump in as well.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you so much, Rachel, for being here. During all the meetings that this commission has had, we hear a lot of members asking about where this is happening, how they are doing it, how much money, how this and that. And I think that having you here should be really informative in those questions. So I'm gonna go with two questions. Let me see where I wrote it here. So how do you measure success with these programs? That's one.
Good question.
And the second one, I think, and the second one is what are the kinds of questions you would ask clients to measure whether the program is being successful?
Oh, those are really good questions. Okay. So I would say there are a few different outcomes that you would want to be measuring. One of which would be just qualitative outcomes. Like, are clients feeling like they're being heard? Are they feeling like they're being respected? Are they feeling like the service is actually useful for them? Are they getting connected with adequate resources that are responsive to their needs? Are the resources they're being connected to the right resources? And if this becomes a little bit more complicated to measure, but are they staying connected with the resources that you're connecting them with? One of the things that we know from the data is that the majority of people who are using emergency crisis services, they already have case managers or psychiatrists or an ACT team or someone else who they are connected to. So it's often about reconnecting them with those people and sort of figuring out, okay, so once we've responded to them and we've reconnected them or we've newly connected them, are they staying connected? Because that's going to give us information about how effective our referrals are. And if our referrals are relevant, and also what other services might need to be built to effectively support this team. So that would be in terms of qualitative outcomes. In terms of like quantitative outcomes, you don't really want to be measuring like the number of calls or the length of call. I mean, not that it's not useful data to have, but that's not how you would measure the efficacy of the program. What you might want to measure is this new service effectively diverting people away from police interactions where it's not necessary? Like, if someone has a gun, we're not going to send the civilian team to respond to that. Also, very few of these crisis calls have guns, but just in terms of like, are situations where people don't need police, are they effectively being sent to the non-police team? And if not, why not? Is it because there wasn't a team available, in which case you might need to add additional staff? Was it because your 911 dispatchers are not effectively interpreting the situation and they're thinking it's a dangerous situation when it isn't, or they're thinking it's not a mental health call when it is? So that kind of data is really important. And also measuring effective hospital diversion rates in terms of, are the people who are being brought to the hospital, are they actually being admitted to the hospital? Because if they're not, that suggests that your team is not doing adequate risk assessments. They're over-interpreting and taking people to the hospital who don't need to be there, or vice versa. Figuring out how often are you getting repeat callers, and how often are you getting repeat callers within like a particular period of time? Like if your team is going out responding to someone and then an hour later they're being called to the same person again, that would suggest that you're not doing a good job de-escalating the person. The person doesn't feel like they're at the point of completion when you've left them, so you're getting the call again.
Thank you so much, Rachel.
All right, so I'm going to go myself and then Josie. I'll echo thank you again for all of this. I think you've answered a ton of the questions that I had already, but skipping down, there were two that I was thinking of that are sort of linked. And so one of them is thinking about implementation of these different programs. Is there a rough timeline that you've seen for, or like a process, so that does it start with, is it always pilot program, evaluation, and then implementation? Is there scale up? Are there steps? Things like that. And then thinking about the training and the collaboration that goes with that. So like training dispatches, you just mentioned, like making sure that they have the ability to assess a caller effectively. And so like bringing them on board as well. So because I'm assuming, well, depending on how these are implemented, they're not necessarily the same departments or locations where these are happening. So like thinking about that as part of the process as well. I don't know if you have any insight into how this happens or might happen.
So to your first question, in terms of what the process can look like for different cities, it varies. Toronto is being a lot slower than a lot of other cities about, we're going to take 9 months. I mean, we took how long? Since June to now? 6 months. I can't count. It's okay. It's late at night. It's fine. We took 6 months to do a lot of consultation and a lot of planning, and then we're going to take basically this entire year to plan a pilot, and then we actually are going to have a 3-year pilot, which is very long. Most other cities do not do that. Some cities take a year. Some cities have taken a couple of years, but that typically hasn't been because it actually takes that long, but just because that's how long it took to get the buy-in. Like Portland and Oakland, for example, have been working 2018, maybe, on this, and they're going to be launching this year. Denver was also working for, I think, 2 years before they launched their team. But a lot of cities right now are doing it a lot more quickly. So New York City, for example, there's been a lot of work in New York City that's been done previously, but the city itself or city staff weren't super interested until November of last year, and then they voted and they're going to have a pilot set up by February. And that's a large city. That's larger than Toronto. So they're doing it way quicker. And then you have cities like Albuquerque that are not doing any kind of pilot at all. They're just rolling it all out. And they voted August maybe of last year to implement this. And it's going to be entirely rolled out across the entire city by the end of April. And again, Albuquerque is also a fairly large city. It's about 500,000 people. So, it varies. It seems like a lot of places want to run pilots. The best practice is to run a pilot in multiple parts of the city. But again, for like a smaller town like Olympia, I think they just did a pilot across the entire city of Olympia, especially because Olympia, Washington has a fairly small downtown area where a lot of these calls are coming from, that the majority of their calls are in a very small geographic area. So it was easier for them to just do a pilot that was effective. They didn't need to roll it out in any intense way, but they did do a lot of training. And a lot of that training leads into your next question, training 911 dispatchers. A lot of the cities that have already done this, so Denver, Olympia, San Francisco launched their team November of last year, I think. Cahoots, obviously, especially Cahoots, they have developed super extensive protocols on how to train 911 dispatch staff. They are really good at it. They will consult with cities to help them train their 911 dispatch staff. And so that's something that is really important. And also with Cahoots and with some of the other actually all the other programs that are this kind of model that exists currently, the staff of the new service will carry around police radios so that they can be dispatched directly via the police radio, and they can call back to the dispatch staff. So there's also a lot of training that happens on how to use police radios effectively so everyone is comfortable on the same channel.
All right, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. So I'm gonna go Josie and then Javier again.
Sure. I just want to ask, so a huge reason why like this whole commission is happening is because of course, the very nature of policing in the United States, and you know how a lot of it is also about how police aren't held accountable. And so I was just wondering, what does accountability look like in these kind of crisis response program designs, and what does accountability?
Yeah, so definitely making sure that the model is built by and for the community that it's aiming to serve, making sure that folks with diverse backgrounds are not just like consulted, but are actually co-designing the service, and that particularly folks with lived experience and Black and Indigenous folks and other folks of color are on the governance, on the oversight committee for this kind of service, and are in leadership positions within the organization, and making sure that, you know, and like in Toronto, where we have our Indigenous pilot that is going to be specifically by and for Indigenous communities, that kind of thing is probably, I mean, obviously harder to replicate in a smaller community. Like, you don't necessarily have the bandwidth for like 5 different pilots for 5 different groups. But making sure that those folks, that their voices are prioritized, making sure that you're heavily recruiting from those communities when you are building an oversight body, and making sure that whatever the oversight body is, that it is actually empowered to do things. Like, for example, one of the things that we're thinking about with our pilot is making sure that there's flexibility built into the pilot, especially because it's a 3-year-long pilot, making sure that if we find 6 months into the pilot, we've kept all this data, and the data is showing that we're not effectively serving people of color, for example, or we're not effectively diverting calls from 911, for example, or away from police, for example, that there's flexibility built into that, that the oversight body is empowered to say, okay, we need to change this now, and here's how we're going to do that, rather than everything being set in stone by the people at the top.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And then Javier, did you have your hand up, or?
Lois can go.
Oh, awesome. Lois?
I think you're muted.
Thanks for all of this. It's been great and interesting, and I think we can all learn a lot. We're all learning a lot. I'm wondering, in terms of training for the peers, are there like groups that you're going to, or other places that you're going to train the peers? Because I mean, we have some resources here, of course, but it could be that, I mean, we don't have the kind of we don't have the experience of doing peer support, but also peer support and crisis intervention. And so, are there training places or training models that you think are especially good, or for us to look to?
Yes, good question. So in the U.S., I would say again, parachute program in New York is very good. Also, I think what it's called is intentional peer support. That's like the training that people can get, and like certification that people can get. Intentional peer support, that's what it's called. Also, and the parachute program uses this model as well, the open dialogue model. A lot of different programs use that. I I don't know a super large amount about American certifications or American training programs beyond that. I know more about Canadian ones. We have a lot of really great places in or near Toronto or in our province that do training for peers. There probably are in Massachusetts also. Like, I would just do some research as to like which places in your area are providing peer support and talk with them as well. But those are the ones that I know.
Right, but I'm thinking this combination of peer support and de-escalation and crisis intervention. Because I mean, there are peer support, there are all kinds of peer programs that exist.
Yeah.
But it's this combination that I think is a different combination. And that's the combination I'm interested in.
Yeah, so the programs that employ peers, like Cahoots, for example, 75% of their staff are people with lived experience, but they provide the same training for their peer worker crisis workers and their social worker crisis workers. So I wouldn't get super caught up on like, how do we train peers to do this kind of work versus how do we train clinicians to do this kind of work? I would say just look at, Cahoots has a really extensive, really good training program. They're happy to like consult with cities who want to learn how to provide this training to their own staff. So did, Denver, San Francisco. Also, so San Francisco, the model that they have chosen employs mental health clinicians and peer workers and medics. So I would connect, if you're interested, you or Dan or someone can send me an email after this, or I can maybe I'll just send Dan an email with the name of the organization that is employing the peer workers in San Francisco, and you can learn about the training that they do there, if that would be of interest.
Yeah, I think that would be great. That would be great.
Okay, I will do that. I'll send Dan the email. I will make a note to myself to do that. Okay.
All right, Javier.
Yeah. So the last question, the question from Dan and from Lois, I think it's really important to be clear about the peer-led part of it and how important and relevant to that is, right? I mean, one of the things about Western Mass is that there are a lot of upper middle class white folks that they are going to tell you what you need. Even before you ask, they're going to tell you what you need. And that's something that I personally want to avoid at all costs. Paternalistic and making, infantilism of adults. It's really easy. And being honest with you, a lot of this sort of, I'm not going to say that better. But I do have two questions in relation to peer-led. Can you talk about what peer-led principles look like in practice? And how that does affect organizational design?
That's such a good question. This is one of my favorite things to talk about, actually. This is great. So I would say in terms of peer support values, the values are basically about meeting someone where they're at and having an interaction that is one person to another. It's not coming from a paternalistic place of like, I know what's best for you, I'm going to tell you what to do. It's really from a place of respecting someone, respecting that they know what's best for them and helping them draw that out. So it comes from a place of, a strengths-based perspective and helping and recognizing, everyone has gotten to the place that they're at right now, like because of the things that they've experienced in their life, and they clearly have strengths and capacities and skills. That's how they've survived this long. So helping people find those strengths and capacities and skills. And I would say it's also really about respecting people's choices, respecting people's autonomy, and not coercing people, and not even like, sometimes clinical interventions can be kind of manipulative in terms of like, we want you to do this voluntarily, but if you don't do it voluntarily, we're going to make you do it anyway. So why don't we all just do this voluntarily, and then we don't have to like call in the police and have them handcuff you, like that kind of thing. And peer support is really about not like trying as much as possible to not coerce people in any way. It's really about helping people figure out what they need in this moment and providing that for them as much as possible, and trusting people. When people say this is what's helpful for them, or this is what they need, or this is what's going to help them get through today, trusting that and not thinking that you know better than them. And I think that, you know, in terms of how those values impact an organization or how organizations can foster those values, I think a lot of the mental health care system, a lot of the mental health care system as it exists right now is not really about those values. It's about controlling people. It's about making people act in certain ways or not act in other ways. And I think that it's really important that, you know, within an organization, the values, it comes from the top. Peer workers can't do their best work when they're within an organization that is telling them to coerce and manipulate and disrespect their clients. Like, then you don't really have peer workers. You have people with lived experience who you are making be less true to themselves or less true to the work that they are being called to do. So it's really important that whichever, you know, whether it's an organization operating this new service or whether it's the city directly and they're being employed directly by the city, that whoever is in charge, that the values that they're bringing are the values of respect, of trust, of openness, and of seeing the people that we're helping as equals, as people who also have lots of wisdom and knowledge and strength and skill, and that our job is really to help them find that in themselves rather than to impose on them or treat them like we know better than they do, because people are the experts of their own lives. Does that answer your question sufficiently?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much.
All right, Michael.
Thanks, Dan. I was having trouble raising my hand. Well, Rachel, thank you so much. This has been informative. You've brought us a lot of information, but also, I think, inspiration based on so much of what you've brought to us here are things that I think a lot of this group aspires to. And so this is so encouraging. The question that I have for you is, and I do think they're rare, but here in Northampton, what we're talking about is a reduction of the, you know, policing, right? So, and what we're talking about is paying for the reduction. Like, if we're going to reduce what the police are responsible for, we're going to reduce the budget. And what do we use? How do we use that money? But the question that I get a lot from people, community members that are asking about this sort of thing in terms of creating something like what you're talking about is, what do you do when and I agree they're rare, by the way. I just am trying to be able to put this answer into words properly. What do you do when a mental health response, crisis response, does turn violent? How do you protect the community, and how can the community feel that they're going to be safe because even though you're, you know, diverting resources to one thing to try to work towards a solution on one end, but there are going to be those occasional times that you need both.
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked this question. I was actually waiting for this question to come up because this is our #1 frequently asked question, like head and shoulders above any other question we get from the media, anytime from people when we do presentations, like #1 question. So thank you for calling it. Okay, so because this is our #1 frequently asked question, I have some good data to share about how other cities do this. So the first thing to know is that these kinds of teams, you know, they will respond to mental health crisis. They will respond to the majority of mental health calls. They're not going to be able to respond to every single mental health call. They can respond to most. But, you know, sometimes we get questions like about our teams that we're proposing in Toronto, and people are like, well, how would this team respond to a mass shooting? And we're like, you know, we are not responding to mass shootings. Like, that's just not something our team would do. Like, you send police to respond to a mass shooting. Like, that continues. And, you know, the same thing if someone is already acting, like if someone has already stabbed someone or something like that, maybe they're in a mental health crisis, maybe not. But, you know, you wouldn't send your civilian team if serious violence is currently happening or has already happened. You just wouldn't send the team. You might send the team like what we see with cahoots, for example, is where there might be weapons involved. They will sometimes send cahoots with the police, but police are there. They're not sending the civilian team only to most of these calls. Now, what we also see from the stats is that majority of these calls don't involve weapons or violence. And what we also find, like with teams like Cahoots that have been around for a really long time, you guys can all tell I really like Cahoots. I really like them. But for teams that have been around for a really long time, they, like initially Cahoots, for example, would not respond to any calls 31 years ago. They wouldn't respond to calls that had weapons involved, like any type of weapon. But over time, they collected a lot of really good data on the types of calls that they were going to and what the outcomes were of those calls. So what they found was that there were a lot of self-harm calls that they were currently responding, or at that time responding to with the police, but these calls they were not violent, like someone who was using a knife or a razor to cut themselves. They were not finding that people were turning those knives towards the police and charging at them. That just was never happening. So Cahoots started to take these calls by themselves and started to do some training for 911 dispatchers to help them determine, to ask some questions to be like, is this a knife that is being used to threaten others? Like if you have someone who is charging at their mother with a knife, that's a very different situation than a teenager who's cutting themselves. So sort of making those kinds of distinctions, but obviously in situations like mass shooting, you're not sending the civilian-led team. And in those kinds of situations, you probably want a co-response where you have the police who are there to take care of the physical safety and the mental health workers who are there to do the verbal de-escalation. And one of the things that you see with teams like Cahoots and other similar teams like in Denver and Olympia, the teams carry police radios so they can call police quickly and have police respond quickly if the situation does escalate. It happens very rarely, but when it does happen, police get there very quickly. And also vice versa, that if police are on the scene and then they're like, oh, this was initially coded as a violent, dangerous call, but this is actually a mental health call, they can call in Cahoots and they've built a lot of trust. So they work really well together. Where there is violence, Cahoots is comfortable to let the police take the lead, but also where there's a mental health issue, police are comfortable letting Cahoots take the lead. And then last thing I'll say about violence is just that we actually collected a whole bunch of data from the teams that exist currently, because this was something we kept hearing in Toronto about, just wait until the first person gets killed. So we actually called all of the teams that we know of that do this kind of work, which was a lot of teams. And we asked them, what are the rates of staff injuries or even injuries of clients on your teams? Are you finding that your staff are regularly being threatened or harmed or killed? And what we found was none of the teams, including Cahoots, which is, took 24,000 calls last year, has been around for 31 years. They've never had a death or serious injury of a staff member ever. It just hasn't happened. They have, minor injuries about once a year out of 24,000 calls. And what we heard from other teams was quite similar in terms of very never any serious injuries or deaths, just had never happened. And in terms of minor injuries, we talked with a team in the Bay Area that took 15,000 calls last year. They had 2, I think, minor injuries or 3 minor injuries, one of which was a client who spit at a staff member, one of which was a staff member who hurt her finger. I think she got it stuck in a door or something like that. And one of which was a potential COVID exposure that turned out negative. So those are the kind of injuries you're thinking about on this team. The biggest cause of injury to staff members on these teams is actually car accidents. We've heard a lot of stories about, not a lot, but when we ask how many staff injuries you've had in the past years or the past couple of years, what we hear is, oh, our car got rear-ended on the way to a call, that kind of thing.
Right, during the response.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
So, and not injuries by clients. Injuries by clients, again, super, 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 super rare. When they do happen, always minor, never serious, never deaths. And again, that goes to the trust between police and the service, and it also goes to good dispatching protocols, and it also goes to having trained de-escalators who are working on these teams. having worked in mental health for a while and often working with people who are really distressed and sometimes like very angry because of their distress, like if you're, I mean, I'm not saying this all the time, but very often, if you are like a calm presence who is genuinely there trying to help someone and they know that you're there trying to help them and you're not confining them or yelling at them or trying to control them, and you're just there being like, yeah, I know you're upset. I'm here to help you. What can I do to help you? Please tell me what you want and I'll try to do that for you. Like, people aren't just randomly attacking you. It does happen occasionally. It's very, very, very rarely.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And then Elizabeth.
Thank you, Rachel. I just also wanted to thank you. I think you're the most perky, very just very just pleasant and just really amazing presenter that I think I've ever seen. So even this is a hard issue, you've been making me smile the entire time listening to you. So I thank you for that, and for the passion you clearly have for the work that you do. Thank you for that. One of the questions I have is actually, the part where I was feeling a little bit, my optimism kind of turned a little bit, is when you actually did talk about that this great, wonderful team is not necessarily responding to all of the calls. And I was thinking about, again, what brings this commission here, what brings commissions across the country together to talk about alternatives to police is the bias that goes into dispatching certain calls, right? Where it's, there's a suspicious person, they may or may not have a weapon, they are a person of color, or they're a Black man. There are these types of things that just automatically switch to, this could potentially be a violent call. And the type of response that happens there versus what you're describing, where someone's approaching a scene with the intent to de-escalate, with the intent to, and the expertise and training to de-escalate and actually support and connect with services, whoever may need it when they arrive, or may not need it, but just be able to assess the situation. And I did put my optimism kind of turn a little bit, thinking, wow, I wish this type of response could actually happen to most calls. Like, I think most calls, which should have this, regardless if it ends up being a mental health call, this type of approach could be so incredibly effective for most types of calls, I would think. And so I'm just wondering how you, what are your thoughts about it, and what have you seen in terms of effective response around dealing with that bias that may come in? Again, not necessarily a clear-cut mental health call, but there might be some other bias that comes in that may actually be really beneficial to this type of approach, and how you are training for and or accounting for an inherent bias when it comes to race.
That is such a good question, and a problem we have thought a lot about and don't have, we have thoughts about it. We don't have a perfect answer for this question because it's something that we have talked a lot about and have been really concerned about. One answer to that question that is not perfect, but helps somewhat, is just with time, 911 dispatchers learn and get more familiar with how calls, with like Cahoots, for example. Initially, their scope was a lot narrower than their scope is now. Right now, Cahoots responds to the majority of calls that are just like suspicious person calls or like trespassing calls or things like that. When we talk with Toronto police about, hey, could you get your 911 dispatchers to send the civilian-led team to all suspicious person calls? They're like, no, dangerous. These people could be scary. They could have knives. They could have guns. We don't have that many guns in Toronto. We have very few guns. But they're very concerned about this. Whereas, once you have a team that has sort of built trust within the community and 911 dispatchers are familiar with them and police are familiar with them, and you're collecting good data on the outcomes of the calls that they're being sent to, and you're seeing, hey, people are not being, like, random people are not like pulling guns out of their pockets and pointing them at your Cahoots workers. That just isn't happening. That's just never happened. That's a myth that people have. that builds the trust, but I mean, that doesn't solve your problem 100%. It solves a little bit of your problem over a long period of time. My other answer, and something that we've really proposed to our city staff in Toronto, is really changing the paradigm that 911 dispatchers are working within. So right now in Toronto, and I assume probably the same in Northampton as well, police are default. If there's any indication that there might be any need for police or any kind of safety risk, or even where, you know, there's just no information about whether it's a safety risk, the default is you send police, you send as many people as might potentially be needed and remove them as necessary, if necessary, or just leave them all there milling around doing nothing. That's the idea. What we want to do is really shift that and be like, we should only be sending police when there is a very clear safety issue that's happening. We don't just send police like preemptively in case a safety issue comes up. So what we've proposed to the city is that they make their 911 call dispatchers keep records on why they're sending a given call to the police. Like if you're sending it to the police, you have to fill out a form saying, here's why I sent it to the police. I sent it because I was afraid there might be violence. I sent it because there wasn't a civilian-led team available, so that we're collecting good data on where the biases might be. Because we know, you know, if, like my colleague Asante, who co-founded the Reach Out Response Network with me, he's a 6'4" Black man. I am a 5' nothing white woman. If I'm walking around in public, talking to myself and wringing my hands or yelling or whatever it is that I might be doing, and someone decides, oh, there might be a crisis going on, they're likely to call and ask for an ambulance. They're not likely to call and say, this person is a violent threat and needs police. Whereas I know, and Asante has said this to me himself, like if he's walking around in public doing that kind of thing, like he's probably going to be called into the police as a safety threat. And that's why, you know, it's part of it is about training 911 dispatchers, but there's some it's biases of the call maker as well. And that's a lot harder thing to deal with. So I think where we're at is, again, not a perfect answer, but it's just figuring out where the breakdown is happening, like being able to measure why are 911 dispatchers sending these calls to police, keeping that information to figure out where the point of intervention is, and also keeping data on outcomes. So where a call was sent to police because it was coded as potential violence, what percent of the time did these calls actually result in violence? What percent of the calls where a possible weapon was mentioned actually involve a weapon being found? So just keeping that information is going to be really helpful.
Thank you so much. That's excellent.
All right. Does anyone have any other questions? All right. Thank you so much, Rachel, for being here and for presenting and fielding all of our questions. I will follow up to the commission with your email as well.
Yes.
And I've got a note for myself to go grab some of the articles that I've read about Parachute to send them along to, so everyone has them. But
great.
Thank you very much.
I'll also send you, so I'll send you the name of the team or the organization in San Francisco, and I'll also send you, and you can share with the commission, the really good article that was written a couple months ago that was like a deep dive into all the different community responder programs that exist in the US, like this kind of model. It is published by the Center for American Progress in partnership with the Law Enforcement Action Project. That's what it is, LEAP, and the Center for American Progress. It's amazing. I will send it, and you guys should all read it, and you will learn lots of stuff. I didn't write it, just to be clear. I'm just a fan.
Great. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much for having me also, and for asking such good questions. These are like great questions.
Excellent. Thank you. So we'll move on next to which is announcements of speakers for the commission or for subcommittees. Do we have any other speakers coming up? Okay. All right, so we don't have any coming up soon. Um, the next item is the subcommittee updates and discussion of the preliminary. Oh, sorry, Lois. You're still muted, Lois.
At one point, there was a discussion, or at least the name of Elisa Klein came up in terms of somebody that might be useful for us to hear from about responses to domestic violence. And I don't know what happened to that.
Yep, it just hasn't been scheduled yet.
If we're thinking about people, I just wanted to bring her name up again for the commission, not necessarily for some committee or other.
Okay. Yeah. I've reached out to Elisa a few times. I can reach out again specifically about presenting to the entire commission to see if she's interested in that. So we'll get that scheduled. But that also sort of leads us into the updates from the outreach or community outreach subcommittee that we will get to as well. So any other announcements for speakers? All right. So what we'll do is move into the subcommittee updates and the discussion of the preliminary report. I do want to make one note here is that the Alternatives to Policing subcommittee was unable to meet yesterday. So during their update, they'll also be working through their draft a little bit as well to make sure that it's ready. So do you have anyone that wants to kick it off to present for their subcommittees? Javier?
I can go ahead, having in mind that the outreach subcommittee is going to be quick. So we met before the holidays, and the committee is me, Dan, and Carol. We have a pretty lively discussion about ways of outreach and how we're going to approach it. We are going to move, so we're meeting January 11th, next Monday. Carol sent me a first draft of a one-pager that we're going to try to workshop on Monday all together, which is going to be sort of the baseline, the starting baseline for anybody who wants to do outreach. That means that if anybody in the full commission wants to go and do outreach by themselves, they would have to use that one-pager. And, the reason is obvious. We want a baseline, so we get a sort of a good sample and a balanced sample of what we're looking for. And also we're talking in relationship to asking questions as such as what people think they would make them safer, rather than just focusing in a specific incidents. And if I'm missing anything, Carol, then feel free to jump in. So I think that's all.
Mm-hmm. Yes, also Javier's idea was having a one-pager that anyone on the commission who was going out to do outreach interviews could use, so that we have consistency. And there's elements in it of what some people may recognize as a consent form. It tells people what our intentions are, what it is that we're looking for, what kind of information we'd like to have. It gives people the right to set boundaries about what they say. It gives people the right to drop out or contact us later and say, I think I divulged too much. I'm uncomfortable. I want you not to use my testimony. That kind of standard consent form. So, as Javier says, this is just a draft. We're going to go through it next week and refine it and make it available to the larger commission.
The one thing I would add to that is also that this is something that we can share with different organizations as well. So one of the things is that if we're relying on organizations or institutions that already exist within the community, or individuals who are very networked into these sort of marginalized groups that are hard to reach otherwise, that they'll also have that same information and understand the policies that we're looking for. So in terms of protecting people and giving them the ability to control what what they're saying and how that's preserved. But our intention is to make sure that the comments that are offered are distributed and maintained in a way that's public as well, so that this doesn't just get buried and it's not necessarily someone who's sort of aggregating different experiences. That we want the same equitable experience as people who are able to come to the meetings and speak for themselves. We want to give other people the ability to have that same voice in this as well. And Carol?
Yeah, one more thing connected with that. We did discuss briefly, and I guess we'll continue to discuss this, that we're talking small town here, we're not Toronto. So that if we have people who are willing to talk with us, who have been living sort of in the shadows and have had, particularly dramatic experiences with the police, though we may want to guarantee anonymity in some cases, if that's what people want, there may be the possibility of recognition because this data that we bring back from these interviews is going to be shared with the commission and is going to be stored. It may be stored anonymously by a number rather than name, but that we need to talk about this more and maybe get input from everyone on the commission about doing this kind of work essentially in a small town as opposed to a large city.
Yeah, and it's related to, we don't have the amount of incidents that Boston, Springfield, or New York would have. So if somebody comes forward with a specific incident, that would be really easy for a police officer or anybody in the community to working on this to figure out who the person was. So we want to address that. And with that, that's a reminder for me to say that we're meeting next week, next Monday from 7 to 9:30. Everybody is invited. Hopefully the feedback that Carol just mentioned coming from the commission, it's from commissioners attending that meeting, because honestly, we want to move really as soon as we can with this one pager, because we want to start just today doing this. Thanks.
All right, thank you. So the next is, or next up, if we want to go in alphabetical order, or we can, if anyone has pressing needs or wants to speak.
You can start alphabetically, but from Z to A rather than from A to Z. we spent like an hour and something talking about the alternatives for the last time. So
then we'll switch it up. So that would be the spending and contract subcommittee. Josie, do you want to speak?
Yeah, sure thing. So we're just reporting out on the preliminary contracts, correct?
Yeah, the preliminary report. Yeah.
It's a little bit on the law side. Is that okay? Do you want me to say the whole thing, or is it just kind of like a quick wrap up of like what we've been doing in the last few weeks?
I think we can go with a quick wrap up.
Sure, sounds great. Yeah. So in the policing review commission, where we do spending and contract subcommittee, we've mostly been really going through a ton of data that has been given to us by the Northampton Police Department. What we've been looking at a lot lately is man hours, or like personnel, total hours of patrol officer time, and all these kind of trying to get to the heart of what is the police budget actually paying for, and how does that compare to other aspects of what Northampton pays towards, say, like the mayor's office or DPW, public schooling and fire. And the more we got into the nitty gritty of the spending toward the Northampton Police Department, the more questions were raised. Mostly on subjects such as accountability, subjects such as like, where is the money going? Why is nothing being accounted for? If I could, I don't know if I have the ability to share my screen, but if I, let's see. Nope, it's fine. That's okay. But in our report, which is in the shared Google Drive, there's these wonderful visuals that Dan has put together using a lot of the data that he's aggregated that show really dark, like these huge discrepancies that we've been trying to parse through. And our work and understanding the budget largely only makes sense when we take into account holistically like what our goal is here. And so the more that we parse through it, the more questions are raised, but ultimately yeah, I mean, it's can you share? Oh, I can share now. Awesome, thank you. Awesome. Okay. So here's some of the wonderful visuals that Dan has spent a lot of time putting together by aggregating a lot of the data, such as Northampton City employees with gross incomes over 85%. We see that 32.7% of them are to police officers and people in high policing positions. Very little of it is toward public schools or fire rescue, DPW, mayor's office. Now, some of these make sense, of course, but a huge portion of them, obviously goes to policing. Then we also have 20 highest paid city employees by gross income and department. And again, we see policing taking up a huge portion of the employees in Northampton who are the highest paid. And so we see mounds of money being poured into this system, and it begs a lot of questions, especially when we take into account total patrol officer time, which we were told the systems that they use at the police department aren't capable of accurately cataloging what police officers do at their time. I know it's very difficult to see, but some of the largest slices are at 0.5% motor vehicle stops, at 0.3% traffic enforcement radar, and then over here we have 96.8% of patrol office time is just unaccounted for. And when we parse through this data, it was really start to think of the fact that over the course of 10 years, the police department has asked for budget increases year over year over year over year. And year over year, the city of Northampton continues to put money into the hands of white supremacist kind of institute that is the police department, and largely unaccounted for. When I see this chart in particular, my blood boils in knowing that we continue to fund policing and increase the budget on policing without question, and without really asking, where are the results? What are the results of policing? Are they beneficial? And it really takes a lot to kind of parse through. And so there are a lot of unanswered questions ultimately at the end of the day. But I don't want to speak for the whole spending and contracts subcommittee, but I will speak for myself when I say when we are going over the last few weeks as we've been going through this data, and as we continue to ask questions, it really makes me wonder if it would not just be better to scrap the police department wholesale and start new with institutions that can be held accountable, where spending can be accounted for, where we can get at the very least understand where all of this money is going in terms of what is actually being done for the community, and maybe work toward reallocating a lot of those funds to these kind of organizations that have proven to work and have proven time and time again that are beneficial for actually protecting our BIPOC and queer communities here in Northampton, and hopefully get them to be able to use the social services that so many people, the people who are using them, I don't know how to put that in words, sorry, but really be able to serve these communities properly because they are paying into it. I mean, that's what tax dollars are. But yeah, sorry if that was really long-winded and wordy. Is there anything anyone else on this subcommittee would like to say or add to in terms of what I might have missed?
Yeah, I do. First, I just want to say that this is on the, I mean, everybody received this, I hope, today, so you can look at it in more detail than now. But one of the things that we mentioned in the beginning, again, is that the 10% that was taken from the police department budget, that none of that money has been spent on any of the things that I believe, and I think probably 90% of the people who testified believed, and even the council believed when they voted for the reduction, would go to. And so that money is, other than about 300,000, is still sitting there since June. At the same time that people are unhoused, at the same time that there's no warming center, at the same time as people on the street are being harassed for being on the street. And so, I mean, this to me is, I mean, Josie said his blood boils when he looks at that graph, which I agree, about how non-transparent or lack of accountability that graph demonstrates. But to me, the fact that this money has not been allocated in the way that people thought that it would be. And I think as we go forward, if we, and I hope we do, make recommendations for continued reduction of the police budget, that it's two sides of the same coin, that the police budget gets reduced and that money goes toward building the kinds of services and the kinds of programs and the kinds of responses that we've just been hearing about and that we're talking about, and that if whatever funds get cut from the police budget, they don't go back into the general fund. And that's exactly what's happening now. And so I just think that, I mean, we put that up at the top, and I just think it's extremely important, and it's important that people, all of those hundreds and hundreds of people that testified, know that this is what's going on now or what's not going on now. And I mean, to me, I just find it outrageous. I mean, here we are in the winter, and well, anyway. So that's one thing that I do want to mention. And then you come up with some, not recommendations, but things that we're looking at in terms of where additional money, other than money that could be reallocated from the police budget, could come from. And that could be some percentage of the $1 million of money that's generated from the police, from the details, policing details, money from civil asset forfeiture, less, not this automatic every year you get to buy 5 new vehicles, and then I assume there will be continue to be when school starts again, not a police, not a school resource officer. So I mean, those I mean, all of the other data you can look at, and Josie went through some of it about the pay and stuff. But the main thing I think that I just want to say again is this thing about the money, this 10% that was taken from the police budget is not being used, and this sets a really, really bad precedent going forward.
Thank you, Lois. I also want to echo that. I think it's imperative for us when we're doing this work that that the original amount of money that was cut from the police department, as Lois has stated, be the money that we work with. Because if that money starts to become liquid or is able to be cut up into pieces and put into, say, the general fund, for example, then it makes our charge much more difficult when we don't know what to recommend for the reallocation of these funds. And so we need it to be set back to the money that was allocated to the general fund. We need the original cut of that initial 10% put into its own category. And I also want to echo the points that Lois made about how, a lot of us are sitting in our comfortable, warm homes right now, while those really marginalized communities are out in the streets or in the forests or different parts of Northampton, really struggling, and would like to openly put my support toward some form of immediacy of some allocation of that money to help those communities as soon as possible. Because the longer we wait, the longer they suffer.
Great.
So does anyone have any questions or comments, anything that you want to make before we move on to the next subcommittee? Alex? And then Nick?
Great, thank you, committee, the Spending and Contracts Committee. I really appreciated the report. I saw a lot of overlap with the alternatives report, also with the policing and practices sub-reports that I was able to look at. There seems to be a lot of overlap, so I think it would make sense for our final report to do a lot of consolidation into a single report. You talked about detail work, and I looked up a bit about that of why we don't see a lot of civilian flaggers for road work. Massachusetts was actually the last state in the country to allow civilian flaggers, and that's one of the reasons we're not seeing a lot of that is the prevailing wage for the work is tied to what police officers make rather than the average for flaggers. So, but I think if reducing police presence on the roads and creating some savings for the city is a policy that we want to recommend, we should look into recommending the use of civilian flaggers where allowed. And then lastly, I wondered if you'd looked into the police union contract at all, and if there are any elements of that that are of a concern to public safety.
So I don't want to speak for everybody, but I'll say that we poked at some of the contracts and looking at the changes year to year for at least a couple of years. There's not a lot that's in there that's related to the police officers themselves or like officer actions while on the job. I mean, there are some things, that are the state level, and we can look to some of the things that came out of the new bill around like qualified immunity, responsibility there. But a lot of the language in the contracts are more geared towards just the basic management, like management and admin functions, rather than like how the officers are, trained, or how they're how that's handled once they're on the force. But we're also looking at, and I've got some copies from other police departments that are also listed as progressive, because I think it's going to be important to see if we have a progressive police department. I'm still not sure exactly what that means, but if we have that, what does that mean? What does that look like? And what do we have that might differ from other departments that are more or less progressive? I don't think that we're going to see a lot of difference between those contracts, but if there is anything significant, we can poke at that as well.
Thank you.
I haven't had the chance to look at the police union contract, and so I mean that's something that we need to do, or I need to do, but I just haven't had the chance to do that. But we certainly will, now that this first round of trying to deal with this, get some of the data, get some of the information, we're starting to get that. We're still missing some of it. And again, I mean, a lot of it is even when we get information, I mean, that pie chart, the big orange pie chart, I don't think we're going to get a lot more information to fill out that pie. Just because from what Jody Casper has written, it's their system just doesn't that data just doesn't go into it, and so they can't get data out of it. And I mean, we did get. I think I didn't really get a chance to look at. I just saw it right before the meeting. A list of arrests for that for I think 2018 and 2019, and so I mean, you get some idea of at least the that part of what the police are doing, and then set all of these other things about which I don't know whether people have gotten a chance to look at about what the different other services or work that the police do, community work, and all of that. I mean, one of the categories that we asked about was there was a category called drugs. And when I think of drugs, I mean, I think of selling and buying drugs. And when I looked through it, which I did briefly this morning, was most of those calls were not about the buying and selling of drugs. They were about the police going out and getting a call to pick up used needles somewhere that somebody found in a bathroom. And that those were the drugs calls. I mean, there were some overdoses, but most of the ones that I saw were about, going and picking up dirty needles. And I think, is this a policing function, or is this something that could the city could contract with the needle exchange people to do? But there was just call after call after call of these kinds of things. So we're still accumulating, and I'm sure the policing services people will look at these things and to see what it is again, to look again and see how it is that the police are spending their time. And we asked the DA's office. It was a question that I had of how many of the arrests actually lead to charges, and of how many of those charges lead to a plea bargain, or if any of those charges lead to a trial, just to try to get some sense of, I mean, everybody is afraid of crime, but to try to get some sense of, this idea of crime in Northampton, and if this is a function of what the police are doing, how much is there really? And I mean, I think we're getting some data, and I hope that the other committee people look at that, get an idea of what the police do and what the need is for police to do in Northampton.
Lois, you're cutting out there. I don't think we heard the last thing you said.
Well, what the police do and what the police need to do in Northampton. That was my last sentence, I think.
All right. Thank you. So, Javier?
I think Nick was first. Or Nick,
sorry.
did you lower your hand?
No, I have a quick question, and I can be brief. Thank you, Lois and Josie. I look forward to reading the written thing that you just put up there briefly, and it looks like there's some you culled some of the data, and that'll be very interesting. I have two requests. I'm kind of embarrassed to ask them, but if anybody can help me access the union contract, I'd be interested in that. And the second one is if anybody knows of a good summary of the state legislative decision on policing, I'm interested in that. But the union contract would be helpful to us in our work at this point on the Policies and Services Committee. Thanks a lot.
I can send you, Nick, an analysis.
Great, thank you, Javier. I would appreciate that.
Sure. Then should I go?
You send that to everybody?
Sure, I will send it to Noah, and she can spread. Then should I go?
Yep, go for it.
Okay, first, I really love what Josie and Luis are saying. I'm on board with you guys. I think, yeah, absolutely. But that also makes me think about something else. It's not only that hopefully we're gonna be calling to divest and reinvest money related to the police department, because we're talking about issues about mental health related to mental health, drug abuse, and others. Also, I'm hoping that we see divest and reinvest from monolithic organizations in Northampton that are unaccountable to the people that they serve. That's also something that I would love to see, because I think that goes hand to hand. And you know, every time that we're having a speaker, I'm talking and I'm asking. I mean, now Joycey beat me to the punch, but I'm always asking, how are you accountable to the people that you're serving? Because if you're not, that's doom. So I just want to remind the commission that in the same way how we're talking about divest and reinvest with the police, that's also going to be, should be part with those monolithic organizations that historically has been in Northampton, that without, you know, without a level of feedback and accountability for the people they are serving, because if not, we wouldn't be talking about this too, right? I think it's all interconnected. The third thing is a question to Michael and Alex, because I do remember you guys, or maybe just Alex, or maybe just Michael, I don't know. You talked about how the money was spent, like what happened with the 10% that was cut from the police budget, and you guys mentioned that that was moved to somewhere. I honestly, the only thing that I remember is that you talk about it. I maybe spaced out during that part, but can you repeat that section? Because I do feel that is important to what we're talking here.
It's in that first paragraph, but yes, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, Alex.
Sure, I could try to recap. So there's a fund called the Fiscal Stabilization Fund. There's a lot of stability in it. And that fund, in order to balance the budget, the mayor back in June was proposing on taking some, I can't remember the exact numbers, but in the order of $800,000 or so from it. When we cut the budget by ultimately a similar amount, only about $50,000 was taken from it. I don't have, these numbers aren't exactly right, but that's the best of my memory. So there was more left in that fund. And then when we had a decline in parking revenue because of the pandemic, we took $300,000 from that fund. So it's not necessarily it wasn't earmarked for anything before, and it was pulled or not pulled because depending on the overall size of the budget. And so so I hope that explains. Does that explain the situation?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay.
And then Lois.
This is just a comment to Javier. I mean, to me, it's the two things that are important are accountability and transparency. And transparency is, you know, they're the two elements I think that we're seeking. And it's hard to have any accountability if there's no transparency. And so just those, I just don't want to leave out the word transparency when we're talking about accountability.
All right. So does anyone else have anything? All right, so then we should move on to the policies and services subcommittee, and then the alternatives to policing. So does anyone want to speak for the policies and services?
AMD, are you interested in picking this up?
Yeah, sure. I was just put my hand up to comment on this. Hello, everybody. Yeah, so so our committee met last week. I think it's been about a week now. I believe it was like last Tuesday, and I think all were present except for Elizabeth couldn't be there. So what I'm going to say now doesn't reflect, you know, she wasn't able to participate in that conversation. I'd be interested in having her chime in for her take on things. But the major focus of our meeting was to get clear about how we wanted to contribute to the subcommittee, to the interim report, and we fashioned a process where we took the documents we already wrote and shortened them to the best of our abilities. And Nick and I have been working to generate a shorter, you know, submission. That submission now is about 5 pages long, at least the version I think I've seen. And what it does is it you know, just to recap what I've said in our last meeting, it's an effort to kind of just briefly summarize, you know, the policies and services that we've initially taken a look at. And that is the focus on school resource officers, on domestic violence, on traffic, on, I think what else is on our list. We looked at traffic. Also, we've been interested in, you know, cases of sexual assault, which came up. We looked also at mental health, and have kind of elaborated on all of these sectors with the focus on what Northampton is, you know, kind of currently doing. And in each case, you know, we in this version, in order to keep things short, we try to discipline ourselves to not encroach too much on alternatives. So in each case, there may be some passing reference to alternatives, but basically it's just a summary of, you know, kind of what we've said before, which is just to try to say what we see as existing practices, and with the goal of trying to not be too long-winded about it. The report ends with a few future directions that represent our 3 areas we're trying to go more deeply into, which includes trying to get a sense of what's going on with the complaint process, looking at the strategic plan. Nick just mentioned the interest in the police contract, which I think is important as well. I think that's basically it. I think that's how I sort of summarize where we are right now. And I do think there's some overlap in our interests with what other people have said as well. So I think the interesting thing will be to think about how do we pull our documents together. But I think that's basically what I would like to say, comment on. Nick, do you want to elaborate on something that I may have missed?
I just want to say that with respect to Lois raising the issue of transparency, we are planning to continue to focus on the complaint procedure and how it works, and the internal affairs aspect of the police department. And just to say one more thing, as we look at each of these services, we're not just reporting on what the services are, but we're looking at it with a lens of bias, potential bias, and trying to take the mandate of the commission to entertain where services might fall short.
So, Elizabeth, do you want to add something to this? Because I feel like we haven't heard a more recent update on your suggestion about what we should include. I don't want to make sure we don't speak for your perspective.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Yeah.
You know, I think that makes sense. I know that for when it comes to the rape and sexual assault aspects, and I also looked into surveillance and drone use in the city. Again, with an idea of kind of thinking about what the current policies are, as we talked about, and what might be some alternatives and/or other considerations. So it's just a few. I think the emphasis is really about, you know, kind of what are some additional questions and places for additional research versus recommendations at this point.
Yeah, I would say that overall our committee tried to resist making recommendations. I think one thing that was a consensus in the last meeting is that we thought, you know, the purpose of the interim report was really just to comment on our work in progress, directions we're heading, but not yet conclude recommendations. And I also think another theme that came out of our discussion was not to give the appearance of more consensus, either in our group or with the commission than maybe exists. I think that was a tension. Maybe not everyone agrees even on that issue, but I think there've been, on the one hand, there's a wish to kind of in an interim report speak as one subcommittee or speak with one voice. But I think one thing that seems clear to me at the interim is that we don't yet have one voice, and I think it'd be probably more honest to see, can we make sure that each major voice is somehow, you know, represented in the interim report, and then, you know, later on we can see what can we pull together that may be consistent. Elizabeth, are you going to add to that?
Oh yeah, I think that's exactly right. It was more kind of along the lines of what the tensions are, you know, what some of the tensions are that we're grappling with, and it just as we continue on this path of investigation with within the subcommittee and with the larger group.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in about tensions and maybe transparency as well. I'm working on domestic violence, and there's so much talk about partnerships with the police department and other agencies. And so the kind of rabbit hole I'm going down, I have some appointments with the DA's office and also the Center for Women and Communities at UMass, which runs the civilian advocacy program through NPD. So I'm just interested in just what are those partnerships and what does that really mean and what's happening between these agencies and NPD in terms of domestic violence. So just echoing what we're saying, we're just kind of digging deeper and just seeing that if there are tensions, what they are, but also in the interest of transparency to tease these out a bit. When that word partnership is used, what exactly is the partnership?
Javier, and I Carol. I don't know who had their hand up first. Carol did. Okay.
So, question to the subcommittee. I've been reading some of your materials that were posted on the share drive, and you have at least 3 complaint forms, which I found interesting. So you're looking at the internal or external, what the process is. So my question is, what are some of your research questions related to that? Are you going to look at, for example, when civilians make complaints about specific complaints and allegations towards an officer and it's investigated internally, like what's the feedback loop? You know, is there any, this goes with the transparency issue, you know, is there any feedback or accountability provided to the complainant? And then is there any feedback loop to the NPD to correct If it's not just an individual who fell asleep on, on duty, but, there's larger systemic issue that's implied. Is there a feedback loop to improve practice? I mean, are you going to look at any of that, or, like what's the intent in looking at complaints?
We have not, as a commission, talked about that in great depth, but what I can say in immediate response is that the Northampton Police website does outline a process they use for handling complaints, right? So I'll answer your question with regard to what they say they do. And basically, to summarize it briefly, is that the complaints come in and they are kind of adjudicated principally by the chief of police, who looks at complaints really through the lens of sort of three questions. And one is the officer who's complained about found to have violated the law? Did they break the law? Did they break a policy? And so basically, if neither of those things are true, what happens is, as the way I understand it based on the website, is that the chief then would say, if neither is true, the chief would say, basically, this complaint is an invalid complaint and it's denied. But if one of the other things is true, the officer would then be theoretically disciplined. I would say one research question I have is, I think that third category of not a crime, not a violation of policy, could be a very big category that could be the central concerns of the things that have been brought to this commission by public complaint. So it could just be people feeling mishandled, feeling targeted, feeling over-policed. A lot of the complaints that we've heard many kinds of complaints, but just even on this narrow issue of school resource officers is the example I was focused on. So here's a situation where no one has said that the police officer involved has actually committed a crime against anybody. The police officer involved at the school hasn't necessarily violated a policy, but there's a lot of feeling that children of color feel that an armed person in the school is unnecessary. They feel over-policed. They feel that the school is maybe generally discriminatory in how it treats students of color in terms of punishment. And so there's a worry that the police officers would get involved in some way. So all of that, complaints like that would just, in theory, come back as, well, there's nothing here because it wasn't a violation of the law and it wasn't a violation of policy. So I guess what I think my research question is really trying to understand, how can we be accountable to complaints that basically are in that other category that I think really exercises a lot of emotion in our community, and that the police should be in some way responsive to those kinds of complaints. So that's my question. Others on the commission can certainly weigh in, but that would be my initial take on this.
So we have Javier, and then Lois, and then I think Nick, you're also raising your hand too. Right.
Yeah, I want to go back a little bit to what Cynthia said, and I think this is just a comment that I had been thinking a lot, and we got an email to my subcommittee got an email about this today. That for the sake of transparency, we have to remember many times that we're going to have organizations coming to talk to us that are maybe already receiving money for the collaboration between the police and the work that they are offering. So they have high interest to uphold and sustain the model. That's extremely pervasive. So and this is sort of a call to all the commissions, all the subcommittees, to have that in mind, because that's something that is extremely pervasive. If things were working, we wouldn't be here. That's so simple. So I just want you guys to have that in mind, that to have that as part of the analysis, because we may have gotten, we will get comments from organizations that have a huge stake into this. They are taking money home. So, they are not going to advocating against their own interest. But my interest is not their pockets or the money or the contract that they sign. That's not our interest. So I just want to bring that on top of all what is being said.
Great, thank you. So Lois, Nick, Elizabeth.
Well, I just wanted to comment on the complaint, which is, I agree with Namdi that there is this big category that isn't, breaking the law, but is problematic, and there's no way to resolve it. And that is an issue. The other issue is that people's reticence to go to the police to complain about the police. And that is the biggest issue to me. I mean, I have personally had some complaints with the police over the years, and I did not go to the police to complain about them. And so I think, when we look at those complaint forms, I mean, I don't know how many there are, but I mean, there are a few of them. And I think that, I mean, I don't know, but my guess is that there are more people than not that when, I mean, and I had a woman contact me about, she thought that the commission was a place to make a complaint. And I said, no, if you want to make a complaint about the police, you have to go to the police. And the absurdity of it was, when I said it, it's just, but that is what it is. And so, I mean, that to me is another parallel issue about this.
Thank you. So, Elizabeth, Nick, and then Elizabeth.
I just wanted to say that we're kind of at the beginning of this. Carol's questions about what happens to a complaint, how's the decision communicated, and what there are many steps to the complaint process that we really want to look at, and we're looking more at the process. We will be looking more at the process. It will be unavoidable to look at the content of some of the complaints, but the process is what we're really trying to focus on. The content, we're looking at the tip of an iceberg with the content. I mean, we know that the people who complain only represent a very very small number of people who may have reactions or feelings. But what we want to look at is the process, and how does it work, and how does it address the way the police department works, and do complaints lead to productive outcomes? And that's the kind of thing we're going to be looking at.
Elizabeth, and then I'm going to throw myself in too.
I think there's a piece around the complaints as well that does illuminate the vagueness and the lack of transparency in the process too. This is the same with when looking at, for example, the policy around surveillance and drones. If you go to the Northampton website, they'll talk about these different aspects of when surveillance and drones that are equipped with thermal imaging are used in the city, and when they might be used, but it's not specific. It's very general language. But what we know from different watchdog groups in the state of Massachusetts is that Northampton has used them for protest surveillance. They have used them in ways that are, I think, people in this community would find very intrusive and for a variety of reasons. But again, it's the actual policy itself is very vague and allows for a lot of interpretation. I think going back to the spending and contracts presentation, I thought that was really just really remarkable data when it talks about just the amount of money that's just being handed over without accountability, without any kind of accounting of how and why. I mean, that's what I work with organizations and how they spend their money and resourcing the work that they do. That would just never fly in any other type of industry. So why is that? Why is this the only one that allows for large amounts of money to go out the door without any accountability on how that's being used? Policies that are very, very vague, they're allowed to, that have huge impacts in terms of health and safety and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, our basic tenets of our Constitution, our social contract. It just doesn't match. So I think for me, what's really interesting around the policy and procedures exploration is just really to illuminate just how inadequate what they say they're doing and the structure that's built around that activity is to what we're seeing. And I think when we're talking about, we're seeing all these different complaints, even the content of those complaints. One of them included somebody complaining about being dragged forcibly over icy sidewalks and having abrasions, and really at the end of it saying, well, they didn't break the law, and that the police are allowed to make someone comply to an arrest. Again, that's absolutely true, but it doesn't speak to again what we're all talking about here, which is is that the right response? Is that the kind of response that was necessary at the time, whether or not it was legal? The complaint process is just built to establish whether a crime has been committed, not whether or not the appropriateness of the response, or if it's the type of response that actually elicits public safety and protection of our citizenry here in this community. So again, looking at these public policies, I think that's where it's not so much are they adequate, but to what end are they trying to do they exist within, and what is the outcome from that? So I think that's what's interesting about those complaints as well.
All right. So I'm going to go really quickly because I'm looking at the time and realizing, and I don't want to monopolize. The one thing that I want to put forward, and this is both to the policies and services and to the alternatives, because I'm not sure sort of where this falls at the sort of groups that we've created. But one of the things is that when we're talking about people that don't report things, even knowing what is reportable and how you might do that is going to be something to look at. Like, I'll give two examples. I've said this before, where I had a police officer between 10 and like 30 feet away, depending, with looking at me or following me with their hands on their weapons. Now, I'm not going to go over to them to initiate a conversation. And like, my eyes are not great even on the best of days. So I'm not going to be able to see who they are. So it's also thinking about, like, what do you need to make a complaint, and how would you do that effectively? And falling back, like, I don't know why they're looking at me and putting their hand on their weapon. I mean, I do, but I don't, right? And so, like, all right, this has happened twice. I've been, walking in the city of Northampton for many years. I don't have a way to show that this is part of a problem, and I can't even say which officers they were. And so thinking about, and I do know that, or at least the process that I understood it was basically, if you have a complaint about the police, you go to the police. And, I really don't think that, for me, this is just personal experience, personal opinion, like, that's not an effective system. But thinking about the other folks who shared testimony at the same time, it's like, do you know, like, what's required of the complaint process that might actually hinder someone from making a complaint effectively, just as a process as a whole? And I don't even know how to wrap my mind around fixing that through all the different possibilities, but just keeping that in mind, even to say when people are afraid to make a comment or a complaint, but just what would stop them even before that. All right, Nick, and then Elizabeth, I think I saw your hand go up too.
This is what you're saying is just so central to the whole. It's something we really need to take a look at. We're not going to be able to do it in this meeting tonight, but your point is really well stated, Dan. I agree completely.
All right, Elizabeth, and then Lois. Elizabeth, you're muted.
There was can you hear me now? Yes. Yeah, there was a comment about partnerships and how sometimes that partnerships are funded partnerships, but that's not always the case. Not all of these partnerships are funded partnerships, and so we do need to explore that a little bit. Just ask the question, because some of these partnerships with police are actually they're volunteer partnerships, and again, I think that's troublesome. I think it's troublesome that the shift of dollars are going towards an institution with no accountability, where there's organizations that just are mission driven to be a part of something to try to make it better, but are not getting a share of any kind of resources to do that. So I think there are elements of that are happening here. The other piece is looking at the policies around, for example, some of the statements that I can hear consistently get emails about, well, what happens when if the police are gone and you get sexually assaulted, who are you going to call? What are you going to do? So these are part of the scare tactics, I think, that we hear quite a bit. And I think that's another example of, if you go to the Northampton Police website about what the policies are around rape and sexual assault, you have to almost like write out the steps to figure out where it is you're supposed to go, what it is supposed to do. And even then, one of the things it talks about is going to the local hospitals. Again, this is another partnership, just saying, go to a hospital, there's these, rape kits, there's nurses there. They list actually Cooley Dickinson. That's a volunteer program that the nurses have to pay their own money to be a part of, to get trained to do these kits and to be a sane nurse. So again, the website directs sexual assault victims to these other partners as part of the job that they say they're doing, and the reason why they should exist. But again, these are organizations, like in the case of hospitals that are doing these rape kits. Those are nurses that are paying out of their own money to get certified to do that work, and they're not always on call. That's not something where there's always a nurse that has a training on this on call, so that anyone could go to a hospital and see one. So I think that's the type of transparency when you look at these policies and procedures, and the reason for why we have police and why they exist. We got to really cut through some of that scare tactics and really show what exactly is happening, and expose some of that the big holes that are really impacting public safety.
Thank you, Lois. And
well, thank you for that, Elizabeth. I had no idea that was true. That's really horrible. Really horrible. But I just wanted to just come back to what Javier mentioned about programs that are actually working with the police, and so the investment in sort of maintaining or upholding police. I think it's a really important point for us to remember. The other thing I just wanted to mention is that thinking about, like the concern of the outreach group about the how people can be identified who you're speaking to versus going to the police and making a complaint about the police, where you have to write your name down and you have to write, where there's absolutely no protection, at all. So, if we're thinking about the protection of people or how they can be protected, that just the how these two things are just diametrically opposed. If we're concerned about protecting people who make a statement to the outreach committee, but then have to write their name and address down to the police to whom they're complaining about, is again just really a huge deterrent to do it.
hey, thank you, Booker. Oh, you're muted too.
I want to ask that we move to the Alternatives to Policing Committee Subcommittee report. I apologize that we were unable to complete our report in the meeting we had planned to do this, and so we need to use a little bit of this time to work on completing our report. So I would ask that we move on to that work at this moment.
So let's move on. take it away.
Okay. I'm actually going to turn to other members of the committee to help with this. I think the chief writers have been Alex, Javier, and Carol. There is a document that's been up, and I think a number of other members of the committee have actually been looking at that, but we have not signed off on the final view of that. As I assume the other two committees have signed off on what they think their reports are going to be. I've got to say, I feel like Carol and Alex have taken a real leadership role in the document that we've put together. So there's a part of me that wants to ask one of them to look at where we are at the moment. And there are a couple of additions that we all haven't processed yet. So I think maybe what we might do is bring up the shared document at the moment and go through that. Does that sound reasonable to the other, Alex? Dan,
Yeah,
pardon me, but may I call on Alex to do that?
Yeah, take it away. This is your show now.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm going to put a link in the chat for everyone to view.
And just to clarify, if you guys have not read it, there is an edition that Booker wrote that's incredibly inspiring. Sort of, I mean, hopefully you're going to be able to see it now, but if not, I we invite you to read it. It's really beautiful.
Mm-hmm. And Dan, comment. Oh, another comment. I noticed that there's a more current version. We keep developing drafts. There's a more current version than probably what's going to be shared here. And I also wanted to say that I really appreciate Nick Fleischer's contribution to what I wrote because of your work experience. There is a paragraph in there that's not attributed to you. I would be happy to point it out so that I'm not plagiarizing. Thank you for working across so it's good when we can all work across subcommittees sometimes.
So in some point, I want to talk about that part because it's my concern with the email that the subcommittee got today.
Mm-hmm.
Alex, I'm going to keep running this particular conversation. So Alex, please.
Okay. So that should be shared, and Booker and Javier and Carol, you should have edit access. That I incorporated Booker's recent additions and Carol's most up to date as far as I'm aware, but you should look over that to make sure. And then, so I just wanted to say that, if we, and perhaps this goes for the whole commission, that we consider this to be a progress report with various viewpoints. We do not necessarily have consensus on. I don't think that's possible to do. And I wonder if that the chair, if Dan or if would consider writing a brief executive summary that sort of clarifies that, and then we have the three different committees below that. So that's something sort of outside of this one, but I wanted to mention that because I feel like it informs how we're editing this now, to kind of put it as there are very, I worked a lot in the domestic violence section. Carol worked a lot on this section, and we're not achieving. We don't have consensus on it. We consider it a lot of ideas to put forward and putting forward what we're working on. So that's a thought there.
Thank you, Alex. Are there other thoughts? Lois, your hand is still up. Does it mean to be up? Okay.
I'm raising my hand.
Dan, please go ahead.
Just to respond, yeah, I planned on sort of getting basically a simple statement before delivering the report to to the city council to say that this is the most preliminary and progress report that we could produce. It's a summation of what we've done, the areas that we're looking at, and where we're going, but it's in no way representative of what we will actually produce as a group, and that it is full of, I want to say, both, we'll call them the moments of consensus and moments of contention throughout, that we will work together as a commission to understand as well.
Are we gonna put the document on the screen?
Ooh.
I mean, the only comment that I have is related to number 3, because we haven't have anybody officially coming from CSO, or we haven't talked about expanding or adapting the current agency contracted crisis response. So I don't feel comfortable putting that there at all, and not at that length of descriptive paragraph that we have, because honestly, we haven't had anybody from those places coming here, or even from ServiceNet. We can mention that we will, and I think that was something that we talk about. So that's my main concern. But I mean, all the rest looks beautiful. I was supposed to write a connection with Black Lives Matter. I read what Booker wrote, and I was not going to write something to be compared to that, because it's extremely good. So yeah, my comment is just I would just section 3 of the mental health responses. I don't think I mean, mentioning CSO or ServiceNet, I think it's not appropriate from the point of view that we haven't had anybody coming to talk to us about it. So, yeah.
Are there other comments? So I'm going to ask the committee to comment on, do we want to further revise the document that we have as it is? At the moment, it's complete but redundant. And sometimes we say the same things in 3 different places. And stylistically, it's different. In place to place, I feel like a preacher with what I wrote rather than the kind of person I actually am. But I actually was really happy about doing it after doing some of the readings I've done. So I guess I need to hear from the committee. Do we let this sit and turn it into the commission because we don't have another opportunity to meet? Theoretically, this is our due date for turning in our document. That's what I'm really saying. Dan, do you have a thought about that in terms of being complete?
I think that's fine. I mean, I think especially because there's going to be redundancy between there's some overlap between all of what we're doing, right? Because we've divided it up into these artificial category buckets that we've been working on. And I think I'll put in, again, to say that there's overlap in what each report is at the moment that will synthesize into something better. But given the time that we had, this is what we produced.
Alex?
I think that there are various pieces in here that clearly should be removed. For example, someone to write this paragraph.
Yeah, really.
So,
Yeah.
So those should probably either be entirely removed or, listed as in the further work section. And also the substance use section is, it clearly says not fully written. So getting that a little bit more into something that at least we can, say here's our progress on that.
So it's actually interesting. I actually had volunteered to write that section, and I could actually find there's a lot of information about partnerships with police doing addictions work. I could not find any information about a first call response of using for people with addictions. And it's all been this sort of co-management or police being called. By the way, when you research this, actually the major hits you get is the fact that there's such a high level of addictive disorders amongst police officers. That's actually the first hits that you get. I did not want to write about that, but that's actually and actually those of us in the addiction field know that. But there isn't much about phone calls for people being found down. Who do you call? And that's actually why I could not write a section. So yes, I do feel that we should be giving more money to agencies like Tapestry, and there should be better development of other kinds of agencies. But how to change what happens if who gets called, I could not find alternatives to that. The problem is when you call 911 about someone who's overdosed, that goes to the police or to the fire department.
Right.
There's no way around. I think we should be looking for alternatives to that, but that's why I do not have more of an article about that.
Well, oh, sorry.
Yes, Alex, go ahead, and then Carol.
Okay, thank you. So now is the time when we can edit this collaboratively.
That's correct.
We finish it once the meeting's over. Only one person can edit it. So I mean, we could task one person to do that. But so I would suggest that we, as much as we can, just clean it up and remove those to-do things or move them into further work. Also, there was a comment in the chat about, will we get to comment? I realized I hadn't turned on commenting, so that's on. I'm not sure there'll be much opportunity to take in anyone's comments, but they now have the ability to comment. So that's all for now.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm concerned that the document, if it's going to be what we submit to the larger preliminary report for the commission, that it really needs some editorial work. Not so much grammar and syntax, but just fitting it together, eliminating some of those irrelevant notes, formatting it, just formatting it with the margins and all that kind of stuff. It still looks a little rough to me. So that we can only work collaboratively here, and then there's, as you said, one person could take a look at it after the meeting before it's submitted. Okay, all right.
So before we continue with editing, would one member of the committee be willing to volunteer to take responsibility for final edit of the document?
It's due in on the 7th, correct?
I'm sorry, Dan, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I was just going to say that once we get the documents, I'm going to end up doing like the formatting, making sure the margins are set, making sure that it's accessible, that the structure is all there. So I'll be taking time to do that. So it's more about the content, but I would say edit the grammar and things like that too, because I don't want to change your words. I just want to make sure that they fit and work. And then yes, it's so I need to submit and present this to the city council on the 7th during their meeting. So the sooner the better. I'd also like to get them a chance so that they have that document beforehand too, so that we can have a substantive discussion.
Nick, and then Alex. Nick, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. I think Javier's point about putting the names of agencies that haven't come and spoken with the committee makes sense. And I think that a general reference to these kind of services exist, because what we're going to end up with, where we're heading, is the siloing of services, and that the relationships between the police and these various agencies is not what we ideally want it to be. And I think that so that's my recommendation for whoever is polishing up the report. I also want to just let Dan know that we'll get the policy and services report in tomorrow. And Elizabeth, if you have anything to contribute, I would welcome you sending that to Noah to distribute.
Alex, you had a comment next.
Yeah, so this was more general about our path forward as far as working. I talked with the city solicitor this afternoon, and so, you know, we can charge one person with the organization and the final editing of the entire report, and it sounds like Dan is the one doing that. And that person can, if they have questions, talk to one person from each committee, which could be the chair, for example, or whoever we delegate. As long as the number of people involved remains below 7, we aren't in violation of the open meeting law, but we should make sure that that person from each committee doesn't talk to anyone else. So if that's helpful to you, Dan, in terms of, you know, if there's one person from a committee that you can actively talk with, that would be permissible, as long as we make sure, you know, that essentially that's 4 people potentially, and that's well below the threshold.
Javier.
Yeah, in relation to, I really want to get rid of paragraph number 3, mostly because of the sentences coming before each of the number paragraph. We call for immediate city planning initiatives in the following areas. We haven't talked about concerted effort to expand and adapt the current agency contracted crisis response. I mean, I don't think so at all. We haven't talked against, we haven't talked in favor, just we haven't talked. Shouldn't be there. It's and even more because how it's presented at the beginning.
Alex?
However, something about it could be moved to the further work section to make it clear that we intend to talk with these agencies and consider that.
Which is a dramatic change from where it's placed and presented right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
And would be 2 sentences, 3 sentences, rather than 2 big paragraphs.
So just so I'm clear, are we talking about paragraph 3, sort of the 3rd paragraph after your name, Javier?
No.
No, where are you?
No, we're talking about the section about mental
health.
Health.
Okay.
If you go down, there start on
I see.
numerating.
Okay.
So number 3 is the one that
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it can go toward to the end. I mean, and be rewritten in, you know, as, you know, that we're going to look at the capacity of the current contracted agencies and see where they would fit in to a coordinated effort.
that's
Yeah.
That's just what I say. I mean, it could be done in like 2-3 sentences.
Couple of sentences. Yeah, I mean, clearly, I guess I have some appointments tomorrow that'll take up some time, but I wouldn't mind being a point person for our subcommittee to be available to Dan or to touch up this report before Dan works on it. If that would be okay with the rest of you. Yeah, that
Good
would
with
be okay.
Javier. Alex, what do you think?
Yeah, I just want to make sure we get the chance to give all the feedback that
That would be important. That would be important. That would be important. Yeah.
But it sounds like we have agreement about the moving that or deleting that paragraph and instead writing a few sentences about the possibilities and what we intend to research.
Okay, I agree.
Mm-hmm.
Are there other comments? And also, it's everyone all right with everyone if Carol is tasked to be the contact for Dan for final edits of this document. Yes, Javier. Alex, are you comfortable with that?
Yes.
Can I just ask a weird question? So if Carol was editing tomorrow and she said, oh, I'm not sure about this, let me just ask Alex this question. Can she do that? And I'm really asking you, Alex.
No, I don't recommend it because you have to keep a total count, right, of the number of people that you've talked to about an issue, and just to be on the safe side, it would be better to make sure that that total count is 4.
Okay.
That and
then this is 4 across the entire commission.
Right.
Yeah, yeah, and that you know any tasking we're doing now is you know, Carol's tasked for our subcommittee. Dan is tasked with the entire report. Like the tasking is separate, and then you know if Dan has questions for Carol, that would be permissible, but they're not tasked to work together on it. That's because if we task more than one person, that's a subcommittee. So I'm just trying to be very careful about the process.
I mean, the reality that in some point we're gonna have to stop working on this, at least in this draft, right?
Right.
So as Alex you said before, let's try to make as many comments as we can, and you know I have good faith and trust in Carol, so I honestly don't see the problem, and also because this is preliminary.
Right.
Okay. Thank you. Alex, again.
In my section, the overview language to consider, I would like what does the committee think about moving some of these paragraphs into the very first section that Javier wrote?
All right. Can you point us to that?
Yep. So that's on page. Page 11, right at the top of where my name is to define my section. There's overview language to consider. And
Alex, are you able to move? I see what you're talking about. Are you able to move that now in the document that's working?
yes, I just wanted to ask.
I think that's
okay.
I personally think that's a really good thought. What do others think?
Yeah, I agree.
11.
I also agree.
Page 11. Wait a minute. All right, just repeat it. I just found it. Overview language. Where does that go?
That would go integrated into the Javier's.
Oh, I see. Yeah, that it fits in nicely. Okay.
Okay, so I'll just move it, copy it up there,
Yeah,
and then
yeah.
Carol, you can finesse it.
Can you add it with the header that you put just to give some context for Carol, so you know.
Yep. Okay, I just placed it at the end of your section, Javier.
Bikes, you know, if they need a certain level amount of repair, or if they just, if it's a bike.
Okay. Any other comments or thoughts?
Know that no one's gonna want it, or just to have more than people don't want, and so it's kind of like it's just gonna mean, I don't know how to use the word, it's like, so, you know.
Does the Alternatives Committee want to make any other changes to this document before we allow it to move to Carol?
What about further work? Let's see. Further work.
I think that's the section where we talk about where we are, what we're going to be talking in the next couple of weeks.
Right.
Organizations that we may invite, which is one of the reason why I want to just get rid of paragraph 3 and move it to 2-3 lines about that. So I think that's where it goes, and looking more like we can be as general as we want. I mean, we can say that we're going to keep looking into peer-led models and to existing regional organizations or local organizations.
Especially with the excellent interview we had at the beginning of this meeting.
Today.
I feel much more motivated to find ways to involve more peer-related models after that presentation we had.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's a section called ongoing community education and engagement about homelessness, attitudinal change. That seems a little fragmenty here. Let's see, further work. Let's see, maybe it is complete. Maybe I just need to eliminate this bullet point that doesn't lead to anything. Further work. Do you see where I am? It's on page.
Yeah, page 6, right above substance use.
Right, right. Is there anything that anyone wants to add here? Oh, I guess not.
No.
Okay.
That's actually a general problem, that all of the data from the panhandling report and also an excellent paper that was written for the town of Northampton about improving housing, there are no statistics with regards to race in any of those documents.
Okay, so that's an important piece.
Although we're sort of getting here for certain reasons, we have no data about what the impacts are. Any other comments?
The substance use section is probably the least fleshed out, and it is clear about that, but it probably needs something other than something in parentheses at the top about that. Carol, do you feel comfortable writing something there?
Let's see what page.
Well, could we just take out the line about not fully written pieces below and just leave the paragraph that's there below? It is like future further work, but.
Yeah, it might be good to specify that, you know, I mean, we haven't even really addressed this as a committee, but this is, you know, so I feel like it's it needs to be clear. It's almost like this whole thing is a further work, but
Okay, so maybe that's the first paragraph under the title of substance misuse or substance. Maybe I should just lead with that and say this is an area
For further study.
for further study. And then use the paragraph that's there. We believe that.
Because underneath all of the other areas of homelessness and other issues, we keep naming substance abuse as an ongoing issue.
Mm-hmm.
We just don't talk about what role policing should have with it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but let's be careful about language with this. You know, the word using abuse is is a loaded word there.
Substance
So
use.
Use, yes, we should use substance use. Thank you, Alex.
Use, yeah.
That's a good correction. Thank you.
So just mentioning harm reduction here. Already established, and then there's a reference to already established. Okay. Okay.
I appreciate the rest of the commission's patience with us for this.
Yeah, no, really. Thank you. Yeah, I think we can do this. What about this section? There is a number 5, harm reduction and housing programs.
what page?
It is, let me see, let me hover over it. Is it 10? 10?
Yeah, I think it's the same. It's not bullet point number 5 after the 3 that I was talking about, right?
On page 10, maybe
Yeah.
just take it out. If there's a reference to harm reduction above.
I think that, I mean, we haven't talked about that.
No, just
So
delete.
has to be moved to further work.
Further work on harm reduction related to substances and housing issues.
Yeah.
Okay. No, all right.
And also that implies also that we will have people actually working on those fields coming to talk to us. I mean, I just want to be clear with that. That when we're seeing further work, it's not only that we're talking about the topic, but also that we should be invested in looking for people working in those fields to talk about what's going on right now, what can be changed.
So you want to indicate our intention to talk to people
Well,
about?
that we're not only going to address the topic, but at the same time, we're going to invite the speakers to experts on those fields to talk to us about it.
Yep.
We will investigate further the importance of harm reduction in securing housing.
Yeah, harm reduction philosophies and framework in securing housing and okay.
That a possible treatment for substance use disorders is obtaining housing,
right.
which is actually the thought.
Right. I see that someone highlighted under domestic violence and sexual assault on page 11, someone highlighted violence. Let's see. First sentence, last word. Violence. It's highlighted.
There's a comment there, and
oh, there is a comment. I don't see the comment.
I'm not sure. Yeah, yeah, maybe you need to turn comments on. Not sure quite how to do that.
Yeah, I don't know either. Let's see.
Some reason it's on for me. Yeah, I recognize. I want to say that I recognize that comment. And that's not.
Okay, I think there's a comment over to the right. Let's see.
Yes. I'm not sure I can really address that in now, but I certainly want to address that before our final report. There's a lot of things that, yeah, but so I want to acknowledge to Emily that I hear that comment.
Mhm. Okay. Okay, yeah, I see these comments. Okay, that's great. All right, anything else, folks? Because I think I'm comfortable with the task here.
Any other comments going once? Going twice? Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Javier. Dan, thank you for your patience, and those are the rest of you. I think we're done with this document and this discussion.
Thank you so much to you, Booker, for real.
All right. So the next item up on the agenda are updates on new appointees to the commission. And it just so happens that I got an email from the city council president about a minute into this meeting with an update. So I can tell you the first thing right off the bat is that the mayor and city council president appointed all of the women of color who applied already. They were already, that was it. That was the pool of women of color. So unfortunately, that has been pretty much exhausted. So I still gave the preference that we had, saying women of color, parents, and particularly younger parents, and was very clear about the time commitments that we have. We are working. I've reached out to a number of different organizations, hoping they'd be able to help with funding or providing childcare, but haven't heard back yet. Right now, there's one person that the council president has heard back from that is willing to be a part of this, and one person who has declined. So they're reaching out and will keep us updated as much as they can. So we are doing that. That's pretty much the major update, but I think a secondary update to that would be if anyone is interested in being a co-chair at this point, and it doesn't have to be now, and we can talk about this again next week as well. Just I don't think that we will necessarily have brand new commissioners who can jump in and would want that role. And we, unfortunately, at least at the beginning part, we will not be replacing that. We won't be able to replace a co-chair with a woman of color who is a young parent or even a woman of color at the beginning. So that is the update that I have so far. So that's not too much, but I will put that out there, and I'll put this in an email as well, because I know people have had to drop off because we passed our 9 p.m. Just so that everyone has that information and they can nominate themselves if they're interested. But yeah, is there any discussion on that folks want to have? It's not terribly substantive. All right. Oh, Lois?
I have a question. When this gets submitted to the, does it get submitted to the council and the mayor? Is that it?
For the so for the preliminary report, yes, it'll go to the council and the mayor, and I need to present that at the city council meeting.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask. So you submit it, you submit it, and then you present it. And so at which council meeting do you present it? When?
Thursday.
Oh, this Thursday?
Yep.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, we'll be sure to tune in then.
So Dan, you need the subcommittee reports by sometime late tomorrow afternoon, probably, right?
That would be ideal. I mean, thankfully, I've read most of what's written, since there won't be like a super substantively different document. I'm sort of comfortable, but ideally longer so that I can, or sooner so that I can get that into a format and get it to the council so they can read it as well.
Mm-hmm.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, I actually had a question about if we've discussed or there was any thoughts about the mayor's announcement around his not seeking re-election, if there was any indication around this process and the reporting and all of that, given the timing of that announcement.
I mean, because he just made the announcement today, I haven't really processed a lot, but one of the things to note is that our final report is due in March, which is well before the next election would be held. And I think one approach to this is that, this is the mayor's legacy. So what he leaves as a mayor, what he does this year, and especially part of this budget, is going to be a part of that legacy moving forward. But one of the things that I've also noted that I think we're all on the same page that the major changes that we want to see happen are not going to happen within the next 2 months, or within the next 3 months after the mayor is elected. And so I think we can proceed, both understanding that there are some things that the current mayor could do in response to what we're requesting. I think that's pretty obvious, but also that we are making requests, or we're proposing changes that the city council is also going to be involved in, and that the new leadership of the city, whoever that ends up being, can also be involved in too. So it's not necessarily tied to one person, but with the understanding that these dynamics are going to change, and even if we make long-term recommendations that are years out, the composition of the council will change. The mayor, we might have a single-term mayor. So yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Is there any new business that we need to address? All right. And I think we are golden. Would anybody like to move to adjourn?
Move to adjourn.
Second.
All right. Noah, can you do a roll call for us?
Yes. Where are we here? Lois.
Yes.
Elizabeth.
Yes.
Booker.
Yes.
Dan.
Yes.
Nick.
Yes.
David.
I think David has stepped out.
Okay. Alex.
Yes.
Javier.
Yep.
Namdi had to leave. Michael.
Yes.
Josie.
Yes.
Cynthia.
Yes.
And Carol.
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you all so much.
Good night, everyone.